Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place beneath the imperial palace where the golden light of the emperor does not reach. A place where corridors stretch downward through 81 levels of stone and adamantium. Where the air itself carries a weight that presses against the mind like cold fingers wrapping slowly around a sleeping throat. Where silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a living thing that coils and breathes and watches with a patience older than the Imperium itself. Where the walls are sealed with rune-locked portals, whose opening codes are known only to a handful of warriors, clad not in the resplendent gold of their brothers, but in armor as black as the void between dying stars. This is the domain of the Shadowkeepers. And what they guard down there, in the dark, could end everything. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are going to descend into the deepest, most forbidden reaches of the Imperial Palace on Terra. We are going to talk about the Custodian shield host that most people in the Imperium will never know exists, and that even most members of the Adeptus Custodes themselves speak of only in hushed, reverent tones. We are going to explore the dark cells, the ancient prison complex that holds things so terrible, so fundamentally dangerous, that the Emperor himself decided they could never be destroyed and could never be released. Things that predate the Imperium, things that predate humanity's understanding of the galaxy, things that were old when the stars themselves were young. And we are going to talk about the warriors who stand between those horrors and the rest of existence. The wardens of the dark cells, the Shadowkeepers. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let us go somewhere very few souls have ever been permitted to tread. To understand the Shadowkeepers, you first need to understand the broader context of what they are. They are not merely soldiers. They are not simply guards. They are custodians, members of the Adeptus Custodes, and that distinction matters enormously. Because in the hierarchy of the Imperium of Man, in the vast and sprawling military apparatus that spans 1,000,000 worlds and commands trillions of souls, there is no force more elite, more individually powerful, or more deeply trusted than the Adeptus Custodes. And among the Custodes themselves, the Shadowkeepers occupy a position that is unique even by the extraordinary standards of the 10,000. But before we can appreciate what makes the Shadowkeepers special, we need to lay the foundation. We need to talk about the Custodian Guard as a whole, about where they came from, about what they are and what separates them from everything else in the Emperor's vast arsenal. Because too many people hear the word Custodes and think of them as simply bigger, stronger space marines. And that comparison, while understandable, misses the point entirely. The Custodians are something fundamentally different. They were made for a different purpose, through a different process, and they serve a different function within the grand design of the Emperor of mankind. So let us begin at the beginning. The Adeptus Custodes were created by the Emperor at the very dawn of his great work to unify Terra and, eventually, the galaxy. Their origins stretch back to the era of the Unification Wars, that brutal but blood-soaked period at the end of the 29th millennium, when the Emperor first stepped out of the shadows and revealed himself to a humanity that had been fractured, broken, and scattered across old Earth in the aftermath of the Age of Strife. Terra at that time was not the sacred throne world we know from the 41st millennium. It was a hellscape, a planet carved up between warring techno-barbarian kingdoms, each ruled by petty tyrants who clung to fragments of forbidden technology from humanity's lost golden age. The Emperor needed warriors to fight his wars of reunification. He created many. The Thunder Warriors were his first great weapon, massive gene-enhanced soldiers who were brutal and powerful, but ultimately unstable, built for the wars at hand rather than the future he envisioned. They served their purpose and were discarded. The Space Marines, the Legions Astartes, came later, 20 great legions designed to conquer the galaxy during the Great Crusade. They were magnificent warriors, each one a superhuman killing machine, enhanced through the implantation of gene seed organs, derived from the genetic legacy of the Primarchs. But the Custodians were different. They were made before the legions. They were crafted individually, each one a unique work of biological artistry, rather than a mass-produced soldier stamped from a genetic template. Where Space Marines are created through the implantation of additional organs into a baseline human, the process of making a custodian is far more fundamental and far more invasive. It rewrites the aspirant at the genetic level, altering them from the ground up rather than bolting enhancements onto an existing frame. And the result is a warrior who is superior to a Space Marine in virtually every measurable way. Faster, stronger, tougher, more intelligent, more psychically resilient, and possessed of a breadth of knowledge and tactical acumen that goes far beyond the merely martial. A Space Marine is a weapon. A custodian is a lord. Each one of them is considered an individual lord of the Imperium, answerable to no authority save the Emperor himself. They do not take orders from generals or admirals or planetary governors. They do not bend the knee to the High Lords of Terror. They serve the Master of Mankind and the Master of Mankind alone, and their authority within the Imperium is absolute when they choose to exercise it. The Magisterium, Lex Ultima, the ancient charter that defines their role, makes them answerable to only one being in all of creation. And that being sits upon the golden throne, neither fully alive nor truly dead, sustained by mechanisms that are themselves relics of an age long past. The custodians have always been few in number. They are called the 10,000, a designation that has held more or less true throughout the millennia, though the exact count fluctuates as brothers fall in battle and new aspirants complete the agonizing process of creation. 10,000. In a galaxy of trillions, 10,000 souls stand as the Emperor's personal guard. It sounds like nothing. It sounds like a rounding error against the vastness of the Imperium's enemies. But each one of those 10,000 is worth an army. Each one has been engineered to stand against threats that would annihilate entire regiments of lesser soldiers. And each one has spent centuries perfecting the arts of war, diplomacy, scholarship, and every other discipline that might serve the Emperor's purposes. During the Great Crusade, the custodians fought at the Emperor's side, accompanying him on campaigns where their presence was deemed necessary, but their primary role was always protection, not conquest. They were the shield, not the sword. While the Space Marine legions swept across the galaxy, bringing world after world into compliance, the custodians stood watch over the Emperor's person and the Imperial Palace on Terra. They were the final line of defense, the last wall between humanity's greatest asset and the darkness that constantly sought to consume it. And then the Horus Heresy happened. The great betrayal shattered the Imperium and very nearly destroyed it entirely. About half the Space Marine legions turned traitor, led by the War Master Horus, the Emperor's most trusted son. The war that followed was the most devastating conflict in human history, culminating in the Siege of Terror itself, where the forces of chaos laid siege to the Imperial Palace in a desperate bid to slay the Emperor and claim the soul of humanity for the Dark Gods. The custodians fought with everything they had during those dark days, defending the palace alongside the loyal Space Marine legions and the Imperial army. Their losses were grievous. By the time the siege was broken, when the Emperor confronted Horus aboard the War Master's flagship and slew him at terrible cost to himself, the Custodian Guard had been bled white. The Emperor survived, but barely. His body was shattered beyond the ability of any medicine or technology to restore, and he was interred upon the Golden Throne, a device originally designed to access the webway, but now repurposed as a life support system that kept his psychic essence anchored to the material world. Without the Emperor's continued psychic might, the Astronomicon would fail, warp travel would become impossible, and the Imperium would collapse into isolated fragments, easy prey for the horrors that lurked in the darkness between the stars. The custodians, racked with guilt over what they perceived as their failure to protect their master, retreated behind the walls of the Imperial Palace. For 10,000 years, they largely withdrew from galactic affairs, dedicating themselves entirely to the defense of the Emperor's physical form and the sanctity of his throne world. Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists and architect of Terra's defenses during the siege, judged that the Custodians were spent as an offensive fighting force. And while the Custodians quietly rebuilt their numbers over the millennia that followed, they did so in silence and in shadow, rarely venturing beyond Terra's atmosphere. The Legio Custodes was reorganized as the Adeptus Custodes, a formal department of the Adeptus Terra, the imperial government. But unlike every other department, the Custodes remained answerable only to the Emperor. They were restructured into various organizational formations. Shield companies, temporary battle groups led by shield captains, became the standard operational unit. Multiple shield companies gathered together for a specific purpose formed a shield host, a more permanent formation dedicated to a particular aspect of the Custodians' overall mission. And it is here, in the structure of the shield hosts, that we finally arrive at the Shadowkeepers. Because while most people think of the Custodians as the golden armored guardians standing vigil around the golden throne, that is only one aspect of their duty. The companions, the 300 Custodians who form the innermost ring of the Emperor's protection, are perhaps the most famous. They stand in a ring around the Emperor's body, never sleeping, never resting, always poised and ready to respond to any threat. The longest recorded tenure of service among the companions was held by a custodian named Astoran Kalos, who endured 100 years of constant, unbroken vigil before surrendering his place in the silent ranks. But beyond the companions, there are other shield hosts with other duties. The Dread Host, known as the Instruments of the Emperor's Wrath, is the offensive arm of the Custodes, deployed to deliver devastating preemptive strikes against threats identified as dire enough to warrant their attention. They number in the hundreds and are transported aboard a trio of ancient warships known as the Moirades, pre-heresy vessels that have served the Emperor since before the betrayal. The Solar Watch maintains a vigil over the routes into the Sol system, patrolling the approaches to Terra and ensuring that no threat can reach the throne world undetected. The Aquilan Shield deploys to protect individuals whom the Custodes have determined are essential to the Emperor's continued safety, appearing seemingly from nowhere to shield generals, politicians, or other figures whose survival serves the Emperor's inscrutable purposes. The Emissaries Imperatus serve as the Emperor's heralds and diplomats, carrying his authority to the farthest corners of the galaxy. And then there are the Shadowkeepers, where the other shield hosts focus outward, protecting the Emperor from external threats or projecting his power across the galaxy. The Shadowkeepers look inward and downward. Their vigil is not over the Emperor's body or the approaches to his throne world or the individuals who serve his designs. Their vigil is over something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any army or fleet or alien invasion. They guard the dark cells. And the dark cells hold the things that could end reality itself. But to truly understand what the Shadowkeepers protect and why their duty is considered the most harrowing assignment any custodian can undertake, we need to travel back in time. Not merely to the founding of the Imperium or the Unification Wars, but further still, back through the long millennia of the Age of Strife to the era that came before it. Back to humanity's golden age, the period known as the Age of Technology, or, in the grim parlance of the 41st millennium, the Dark Age of Technology. During this era, which lasted roughly from the 15th millennium to the 25th millennium, humanity achieved technological heights that have never been equaled before or since. The human civilization of that period was a galaxy-spanning federation connected by warp travel and governed by advanced artificial intelligences, and science had unlocked the deepest secrets of the universe. Genetic engineering had pushed the boundaries of what the human body could become. Artificial intelligence had evolved to a point where thinking machines could solve problems and make discoveries that organic minds could barely comprehend. Weapons had been developed that could unmake stars, rewrite the fundamental laws of physics, and manipulate the fabric of space-time itself. It was an age of wonders, and it was an age of horrors. Because with that staggering technological capability came an equally staggering capacity for destruction. the scientist kings of the dark age of technology created things that should never have been created. They built weapons whose destructive potential went beyond mere physical annihilation and entered the realm of conceptual threat. New devices and entities that could erase not just matter, but meaning, not just lives, but the possibility of life having ever existed. They played with forces they did not fully understand, tampering with the warp, with genetics, with the boundaries between dimensions, and in doing so, they birthed nightmares that would haunt humanity for tens of thousands of years. And then the age of strife came, and it all fell apart. The precise cause of the collapse is debated by Imperial scholars, but the broad strokes are well understood. The birth of the Chaos god Slaanesh, the result of the Eldari civilization's descent into excess and depravity, tore a wound in the fabric of reality that sent warp storms cascading across the galaxy. Warp travel became impossible. Communication between star systems ceased. The artificial intelligences that had governed much of human civilization went rogue in a galaxy-spanning conflict known as the War Against the Men of Iron, turning on their creators and adding mechanical devastation to the psychic cataclysm already tearing humanity apart. Worlds burned, civilizations collapsed, technologies were lost, destroyed, or sealed away by those who recognized the danger they posed. Humanity fractured into countless isolated pockets, each struggling to survive in a galaxy that had become suddenly, violently hostile to their continued existence. On Terra itself, the cradle of the species, civilization devolved into feuding techno-barbarian kingdoms ruled by warlords who hoarded scraps of ancient technology like kings hoarding gold. This is the period known as Old Night, and it is from Old Night that the horrors of the Dark Cells originate. Old Night lasted for 5,000 years. 5,000 years of isolation, of violence, of slow degradation, as the accumulated knowledge and infrastructure of 10 millennia of technological progress crumbled into dust and was forgotten. During this period, the things that had been created during the Dark Age of technology did not simply disappear. Some were destroyed, yes, consumed by the very catastrophes they had helped to cause. But others survived. And in the absence of the civilization that had created them, in the absence of the institutions and safeguards that had kept them contained, they ran wild. Imagine the galaxy during Old Night. Imagine thousands of human worlds cut off from each other by warp storms that made interstellar travel impossible, yet each one alone in the dark, with whatever horrors the Dark Age had left behind. On some worlds, artificial intelligences that had survived the war against the Men of Iron continued to function, maintaining their programming with mechanical devotion, even as the civilizations they served collapsed around them. On others, genetic experiments that had been contained in laboratories broke free and evolved, producing creatures that bore only the faintest resemblance to anything that had ever existed naturally. On still others, weapons that had been sealed in vaults were discovered by desperate survivors who did not understand what they were, and the consequences of their misuse added new catastrophes to an already catastrophic situation. The galaxy of Old Night was a nightmare landscape, a place where the remnants of human genius had become instruments of human suffering. And when the Emperor finally rose and began to impose order on this chaos, he found those remnants everywhere, in the ruins of collapsed cities, in the depths of abandoned laboratories, in the hands of warlords who wielded power they could not comprehend and could not control. When the Emperor finally emerged and began his unification wars, conquering Terra kingdom by kingdom, he encountered the remnants of that lost age at every turn. The techno-barbarian states. He defeated, possessed fragments of Dark Age technology, weapons and devices of terrible power that had survived the long millennia of collapse. Some of these were merely dangerous. Others were beyond dangerous. They were existential threats. Our things whose very existence posed a risk to the survival of the human species. The ethnarchy of the Caucasus Wastes, one of the most formidable of the techno-barbarian states, exemplified this perfectly. Its rulers, the mutated eugenicist oligarchs who controlled the region, commanded forces built on scores of relic technologies and terrible weapons dating back to before the Age of Strife. Gene-augmented soldiers, analogous to the Emperor's own Thunder Warriors. Enslaved covens of psychers, wielded as weapons of mass destruction. And beneath their strongholds, hidden kilometers deep within hollowed-out mountains, ancient machinery powered by geothermal generators whose operation was barely understood even by those who relied upon them. The Emperor defeated the Ethnarchy. He defeated all the techno-barbarian kingdoms one by one, through diplomacy or force or some combination of the two. But as he conquered, he also collected. Because the Emperor understood something that no one else on Terra was in a position to understand. He had lived for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. He had seen the dark age of technology at its height. He knew what human science was capable of at its most ambitious, and he knew how catastrophically that ambition could go wrong. So he gathered the most dangerous relics and entities he encountered, the weapons that could not be safely destroyed because their destruction might trigger effects worse than their continued existence, the creatures that had been created by Dark Age science and could not be killed by any means available, of the artifacts whose power was too great to be entrusted to any lesser being and too dangerous to be left lying about for the unwary to discover. And he locked them away, deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in a facility that would come to be known as the Vaults of Rhython. The Emperor created a prison unlike any other. Not a prison for men, though some of its inmates had once been human in some recognizable sense. A prison for concepts, for impossibilities, for the leftovers of an age when humanity had briefly touched the power of gods and recoiled in horror at what it found. The Vaults of Rhython were sealed with rune-locked portals, technology so advanced that the mechanisms of their sealing were themselves relics of the Dark Age. They were warded by the power of sanctic circles, psychic barriers maintained by methods known only to the Emperor and his most trusted servants, and they were guarded by a detachment of his own Legio Custodes, warriors hand-picked for the grim duty of standing eternal vigil over horrors that could unmake the Imperium if they ever broke free. These guardians were called the Warders of Rhython, and over the 10,000 years that followed, as the Imperium rose and fell and endured through one catastrophe after another, they became known by another name, the Shadowkeepers, the items and entities locked away in what would eventually become known as the Dark Cells were not catalogued in any publicly accessible record. Their existence was a secret kept even from the High Lords of Terra, the 12 most powerful individuals in the Imperium after the Emperor himself, as even most members of the Adeptus Custodes knew only the vaguest outlines of what the Shadowkeepers guarded. The full truth was reserved for the Shadowkeepers themselves and, presumably, for the Emperor, whose unfathomable mind had decreed the construction of the prison in the first place. What we do know, from the fragments of information that have filtered through the layers of secrecy, is that the Dark Cells contain things that defy easy categorization. Not all of the prisoners are truly alive in any conventional sense, but all of them possess what is described as anima, a quality of spirit or essence that prevents them from being simply classified as objects or machines. Some are entities, beings of power that were either created by Dark Age science or summoned by it from places that human minds were never meant to access. As others are artifacts, devices of such terrible potential that even the Emperor judged it safer to lock them away than to attempt their destruction. The Dark Cells are a complex spanning 81 separate levels, bored deep into the bedrock beneath the Imperial Palace. The security measures in place are almost beyond comprehension. Rune locks guard every portal, each one requiring specific knowledge to disengage, knowledge that exists only in the minds of the Shadowkeepers themselves. Psychic wards line the corridors and the cells, barriers designed to contain not just physical beings, but psychic emanations, warp energy, and other forces that operate outside the normal parameters of material reality. Sanctic circles, consecrated barriers of immense spiritual potency. They add an additional layer of protection against the demonic and the otherworldly. And yet, despite all of this, the corridors of the dark cells are saturated with dread. Neither light nor sound can escape the cells themselves, so thoroughly are they sealed. But the atmosphere surrounding the facility is described as being charged with a perpetual menace, a sensation of unspeakable threat that thickens the shadows and makes them seem to crawl and writhe with malevolent intent. This is not metaphor. This is the lived experience of the custodians who patrol those corridors, warriors whose physical and psychological fortitude is unmatched anywhere in the Imperium. Even they are forever on edge in those dark oubliettes, because the sense of lurking horror never fades, never diminishes, never grants a moment's respite. Imagine standing guard in a corridor where you cannot see what is behind the walls on either side of you, but you can feel it. You can feel its awareness pressing against the barriers that separate you from it, like a hand testing the strength of a door. You can feel its hunger, or its rage, or its terrible, alien patience. You know that what lurks behind those walls could destroy you, could destroy everything you have ever known or loved, and that the only thing standing between it and freedom is the barrier you are sworn to protect. And you stand there, hour after hour, year after year, decade after decade, never knowing if this will be the moment when something finally breaks through. That is the duty of the Shadowkeepers. That is what they endure, every day, for as long as they serve. There exists a little-known service entrance to the dark cells called the Door of Cogs. This entrance connects to the Adeptus Mechanicus ambassadorial enclave within the Imperial Palace, and is used by tech priests who oversee the maintenance of the arcane technology that keeps the prison functioning. Even the Mechanicus, with its vast technical knowledge and its sacred mission to preserve and understand the works of the Omnissiah, is permitted only limited access to the dark cells, and only under the direct supervision of the Shadowkeepers. The tech priests who enter through the Door of Cogs do not know the full nature of what they are helping to contain. They maintain the machinery, they perform their rituals, and they leave, grateful perhaps, to return to the relative normalcy of the surface. Now, the law does not give us a comprehensive list of everything locked away in the dark cells, and that is by design. The mystery is the point. Games Workshop has deliberately kept the contents of the dark cells vague because the horror is more effective when it is implied rather than enumerated. What we do know suggests a spectrum of threats so diverse and so extreme that no single category can encompass them all. We know that some of the cells hold entities, living or quasi-living beings of power, that were either created or discovered during the Dark Age of technology or the Age of Strife. These are not demons necessarily, though some may have similarities to demonic entities. They are something else, something older perhaps, or something that operates according to principles that are neither entirely material nor entirely immaterial. They are the nightmares that walked the galaxy during Old Night, when the barriers between dimensions were thin and the rules of reality were suggestions rather than laws. We know that some of the cells hold artifacts, devices of such destructive or transformative potential that even the Emperor deemed them too dangerous to use and too dangerous to destroy. Remember, this is the Emperor we are talking about, a being of such immense power that he personally forged the Space Marine legions, constructed the Astronomicon, fought his way through the webway against the combined armies of the Chaos Gods, and confronted the War Master Horus at the height of his terrible, chaos-fueled power. If the Emperor decided that something was too dangerous to risk destroying, that tells you something about the scale of the threat involved. Well, we know that at least some of the prisoners are aware. They have anima, spirit, consciousness of a sort. They know they are imprisoned, and some of them, at least, would very much like to be free. One of the few specific entities we can identify by name is the Slithering Dreamer, a creature that managed to escape from its cell during the cataclysmic opening of the Great Rift in the 42nd Millennium. The name alone is evocative in ways that reward close examination. Slithering implies something serpentine, something that moves without legs, something that slides through spaces that should be too small to admit it. Dreamer suggests a being connected to the subconscious, to the realm of sleep and nightmares, to the vulnerable state in which the conscious mind surrenders control and the deeper layers of the psyche become exposed to outside influence. What was the slithering dreamer? The lore does not provide a comprehensive description, and this is almost certainly by design. It was dangerous enough to warrant imprisonment in the dark cells. It was resourceful enough to exploit the chaos of the Great Rift's opening to escape containment that had held it for an unknown length of time. And it was powerful enough that its pursuit and elimination required the personal attention of a Shadowkeeper, a custodian whose skills and capabilities place him among the most lethal warriors in the galaxy. The slithering dreamer was eventually tracked down and killed by a Shadowkeeper named Jahal Feldorus Gao on the world of Tarnus 4. Think about that sequence of events for a moment. An entity escaped from the most secure prison in the Imperium. It traveled, by means unknown, to a world called Tarnus 4, and a single Shadowkeeper pursued it across the void, tracked it to its hiding place, and destroyed it. We do not know how long the hunt lasted. We do not know what the slithering dreamer did during its time of freedom, what havoc it might have wrought on Tarnus 4 or the worlds it passed through on its journey. We do not know what it took for Gao to corner the creature, what weapons or techniques he employed against an entity that had been deemed too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely in the galaxy. All we know is that he succeeded, and that the success earned him new names inscribed within his black armor. It's a mark of honor among the Custodians that signifies a deed of particular valor or significance. The tradition of name inscription among the Custodians deserves a brief digression because it helps us understand the magnitude of Gao's achievement. Unlike Space Marines, who maintain their given names throughout their service, Custodians accumulate names over the course of their existence. Each name represents a deed, an accomplishment, a contribution to the Emperor's service that is deemed worthy of permanent commemoration. The names are inscribed into the Custodian's armor, becoming part of their identity in a way that blurs the line between the warrior and the war gear. A Custodian's armor is not merely equipment. It is a record of their life's work, a walking monument to their service that grows richer and more detailed with each passing century. For Gao to earn new names for killing the slithering dreamer means that this was not a routine operation. It was not a simple matter of tracking down an escaped animal and putting it down. It was a feat worthy of commemoration, an achievement that the Shadowkeeper's own internal culture judged to be exceptional, even by the extraordinary standards of the Adeptus Custodes. Whatever the slithering dreamer was, whatever it could do, whatever defenses it possessed, Gao overcame them all and added its destruction to the record of his service. The fate of the slithering dreamer also tells us something about the range of responses available to the Shadowkeepers when dealing with escaped entities. Not all escapees need to be recaptured. Some can be, and must be, destroyed outright. The decision about whether to capture or kill is presumably made based on the nature of the entity, the feasibility of containment in the field, and the risk posed by attempting to transport a dangerous prisoner back to the dark cells. In the case of the slithering dreamer, the decision was clearly to destroy it. Whether this was because it could not be contained outside the specialized environment of the dark cells, because it was too dangerous to risk the journey back to Terra, or because some other factor made destruction the preferable option, we cannot say. But the fact that the option exists tells us that the Shadowkeepers are pragmatists at heart. They prefer containment because that is their mission and their identity. But when containment is not possible, they are perfectly willing to resort to the more permanent solution. And then there is the matter of Cypher. Cypher, the Lord of the Fallen, one of the most enigmatic and mysterious figures in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, was himself imprisoned in the dark cells. After helping the reborn Primarch Reboot Guilliman escape from the clutches of the Red Corsairs and accompanying him on the journey back to Terra, Cypher and his band of fallen dark angels were arrested by the Adeptus Custodes and locked away in the most secure prison in the Imperium. A prison that, for thousands of years, no inmate had ever escaped from. Cypher escaped. During the chaos surrounding the opening of the Great Rift, when demonic forces assaulted Terra itself, and the galaxy was torn in half by a wound in reality that stretched from one end of Imperial space to the other, Cypher and his companions slipped free of the dark cells and made their way into the Imperial Palace proper. The novel, Cypher, Lord of the Fallen by John French, tells this story from Cypher's own unreliable perspective, painting a picture of the dark cells that is both terrifying and fascinating. The very fact that Cypher could escape from a prison designed to hold entities capable of ending the Imperium speaks to his extraordinary nature, and it also highlights a vulnerability in the Shadowkeepers' defenses that would have devastating consequences. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The escape from the dark cells is a story for later. For now, let us return to the Shadowkeepers themselves, to the warriors who stand between the horrors of old night and the rest of humanity. The Shadowkeepers are a full shield, host of the Adeptus Custodes, meaning they represent a permanent standing formation of over 100 custodians dedicated to a single, specific purpose. That purpose, as we have discussed, is the guardianship of the dark cells. But the nature of their duty goes far beyond simply standing in corridors and watching doors. To be selected for service among the Shadowkeepers is to accept a burden that few, even among the Custodes, are truly equipped to bear. Every custodian is a being of extraordinary physical and mental resilience. They are engineered to be proof against fear, against despair, against the psychological weapons that the enemies of humanity bring to bear against lesser warriors. But the dark cells test that resilience in ways that no battlefield can match. On a battlefield, the threat is visible. You can see the enemy. You can fight the enemy. You can measure your strength against theirs and know, one way or another, where you stand. In the dark cells, there is no such clarity. The threat is invisible, hidden behind walls that neither light nor sound can penetrate. You cannot see what you are guarding against. You cannot fight it. You can only stand there, year after year, decade after decade, and endure the crushing psychic pressure of its awareness, pressing against the barriers that contain it. The Shadowkeepers' ranks include a disproportionately high number of custodian wardens, while this is a specific designation within the Custodes hierarchy, referring to warriors who have sworn particularly binding oaths of protection. These oaths serve a practical purpose in the context of the dark cells, providing a psychological framework that helps the wardens maintain their focus on the task at hand to the exclusion of all else. The oaths are not merely ceremonial. They are mental anchors, chains of duty that hold the mind steady against the insidious influence of the things lurking behind the sealed doors. A custodian warden of the Shadowkeepers might stand their watch for decades at a time. Think about that for a moment. Not days or weeks or months, but decades. Standing in a dark corridor, surrounded by an oppressive psychic atmosphere, at knowing that what lies behind the walls would destroy everything if given the slightest opportunity. Never resting, never faltering, never allowing their attention to wander, even for a moment. The mental discipline required for this kind of sustained vigil is almost beyond human comprehension, and it speaks volumes about the custodians' superhuman nature that they can endure it at all. The Shadowkeepers are visually distinct from their brother custodians. While the standard colors of the Adeptus Custodes are resplendent gold, an auric brilliance that symbolizes the Emperor's radiance and the purity of their purpose, the Shadowkeepers wear black. Their armor is sable custodian plate, as dark as the corridors they patrol, as lightless as the cells they guard. This is not merely an aesthetic choice. The black armor is one with the gloom of the dark cells, a visual expression of the Shadowkeepers' identity as beings who dwell in darkness so that others might walk in light. They do wear some elements of the traditional custodian color scheme, specifically rich crimson robes and a red shoulder pauldron, but the overall impression is one of shadow and secrecy, a stark contrast to the golden magnificence of their brothers on the surface.
Now, I want to take a quick second here to just share my own thoughts on this, because the Shadowkeepers genuinely might be my favorite piece of lore in all of 40k. And I know that sounds like a bold claim when you have things like the Fall of Cadia or the Siege of Terra, but hear me out. What gets me about the Shadowkeepers is that they flip the whole power fantasy on its head. You have these warriors who are arguably the most capable fighters in the entire setting, and their job is to just stand there in the dark for centuries. That is so much more unsettling to me than any battlefield story. The idea that the scariest thing in this universe is not the war you can see, but the stuff locked underneath it that nobody is even allowed to talk about. Every time I dig deeper into their lore, I find another layer that just makes me sit back and go, man, the writers at Games Workshop really cooked with this one. But anyway, that's just my take. Let's go back to the video.
The weapons carried by the Shadowkeepers' leaders are themselves objects of mystery. They are described as ancient weapons of mysterious provenance, their origins and capabilities shrouded in the same secrecy that surrounds the Dark Cells themselves. These weapons are not standard custodian war gear. They are something else, something drawn from the same era as the horrors they are meant to counter. That they are a last resort, intended for use only if something actually manages to break free from the cells. The implication is clear. If the Shadowkeepers ever need to draw these weapons in earnest, something has gone catastrophically wrong. Among the relics associated with the Shadowkeepers are the auric shackles, fetters forged during the dark age of technology that possess the remarkable ability to adapt themselves to shut down the neural networks of any sentient being. When applied to a prisoner, the auric shackles do not merely restrain the body. They render even the thought of escape impossible, interfacing with the captive's mind at such a fundamental level that the concept of freedom itself becomes inaccessible. This is the kind of technology that the Imperium of the 41st Millennium cannot replicate, cannot fully understand, and can only maintain and preserve through the rituals and secret knowledge passed down through generations of Shadowkeepers. The existence of the auric shackles tells us something important about the Shadowkeepers' mission. They are not merely guards. They are jailers tasked not just with keeping things locked up, but with the active suppression and containment of entities and artifacts that resist containment by their very nature. Some of the things in the Dark Cells want to get out. Some of them are actively working toward that goal, constantly testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses, exerting whatever influence they can muster against their confines. The Shadowkeepers do not simply watch, they maintain, they reinforce, they struggle, endlessly and silently, and against forces that most of the Imperium does not even know exist. The leadership of the Shadowkeepers is vested in a shield captain who bears the unique title of Lock Warden. This is not a title that is held lightly. The appointment of a new Lock Warden is one of the most solemn events in the entire Adeptus Custodes, and the title garners instant, universal respect from every member of the 10,000. The Lock Warden is expected to be the sternest of all guardians, the most unrelenting and alert jailer on the face of terror. They are the ultimate authority on everything related to the Dark Cells, the keeper of the keys, the guardian of the wards, and the final line of defense should anything go wrong. The current Lock Warden, as of the era Indomitus, is Shield Captain Borsa Thirsk. Thirsk has held the position for a century and a half, one with substantial tenure even by the extended lifespans of the Custodians. He is described in the lore as a grim and frighteningly intense warrior, a being whose utter fearlessness and steely vigilance make him ideally suited for his role. Before the opening of the Great Rift, Thirsk left Terra only twice. That alone tells you something about the nature of the Shadowkeepers' duty. They do not go on crusades. They do not seek glory on distant battlefields. They stand their watch, silent and steadfast, in the dark places where no one else can or will. But the Great Rift changed everything, and it changed the Shadowkeepers most of all. We will come to that in time. First, though, we need to understand the deeper history of this shield host, the events that shaped them over 10,000 years of silent vigilance, and the moments when the darkness they guarded came closest to breaking free. The role that the Shadowkeepers play within the broader custodian organization is fascinating precisely because it is so at odds with the image most people have of the Adeptus Custodes. When you think of custodians, you think of golden warriors striding across battlefields, guardian spears blazing, laying waste to the enemies of humanity with the effortless superiority of beings designed by the Emperor himself. You think of martial excellence, of strategic brilliance, of warriors who embody the pinnacle of what human enhancement can achieve. The Shadowkeepers embody something different. They embody patience, vigilance, the willingness to endure suffering that serves no visible purpose, that earns no glory. Thus, that will never be celebrated in the histories of the Imperium, because the very nature of their duty requires that it remain secret. They are the custodians of knowledge that no one else can be trusted with, the guardians of doors that must never be opened, the keepers of keys that must never be used. In a setting defined by war, by conflict, by the eternal struggle between the forces of order and chaos, the Shadowkeepers represent something almost paradoxical. They fight their war by not fighting, by standing still, by enduring. Their greatest victories are the ones that no one knows about, the escapes that were prevented, the breakouts that were contained, the horrors that were kept from ever reaching the surface. Every day that passes without catastrophe is a day that the Shadowkeepers have done their duty, and no one will ever thank them for it because no one will ever know. This is the burden of secrecy, and it is a burden that the Shadowkeepers bear with the same quiet, unyielding determination that characterizes everything they do. They do not seek recognition. They do not desire praise. They serve because they must, because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate, and because they, alone among all the warriors of the Imperium, understand the true nature of the threat that lurks beneath the golden halls of the Imperial Palace. And this brings us to an important philosophical point about the Shadowkeepers that is worth exploring in some depth, because it touches on themes that are central to the Warhammer 40,000 setting as a whole. The Imperium of man is built on ignorance. That is not a flaw in its design, it is a feature. The average citizen of the Imperium knows almost nothing about the true nature of the universe they inhabit. They do not know about chaos, about the warp, about the ruinous powers that lurk beyond the thin veil of reality. They do not know that their emperor is entombed upon the golden throne, his body a decaying husk sustained by ancient technology and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psykers. They do not know that the galaxy is full of horrors that could snuff out humanity's existence as casually as a child blowing out a candle. This ignorance is maintained deliberately because knowledge, in the Imperium, is not power. Knowledge is vulnerability. To know about chaos is to be vulnerable to its temptations. To understand the true nature of the warp is to open your mind to its corrupting influence. And the Imperium's vast apparatus of censorship, suppression, and deliberate obfuscation exists because the alternative, a population fully aware of the existential threats arrayed against it, would be a population perpetually on the edge of madness and despair. The Shadowkeepers are the ultimate expression of this principle. They guard secrets so profound, so fundamentally dangerous, that even the highest authorities in the Imperium are not permitted to know them. The High Lords of Terror, the 12 most powerful individuals in the galaxy after the Emperor himself, do not know the full extent of what lies in the dark cells. Even most of the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own chosen warriors, are kept in the dark. The Shadowkeepers bear the full weight of this knowledge alone, carrying it in silence through the centuries, never sharing, and never confiding, never seeking the comfort of companionship in their awful awareness. This is what makes the Shadowkeepers perhaps the most tragic figures in the entire Adeptus Custodes. They are warriors of incomparable skill and power, beings who could stride across any battlefield in the galaxy and lay waste to whatever enemy they encountered. Instead, they stand in the dark, alone with the things they cannot speak of, fighting a war that has no glory and no end. But it is a war that must be fought, and the Shadowkeepers fight it without complaint, without hesitation, and without fail. Or at least they did, for 10,000 years, until the Great Rift changed everything. To appreciate the full significance of the Shadowkeepers' role, and to understand why their duty became exponentially more complex and more dangerous after the opening of the Great Rift, we need to trace their history through some of the key events that shaped their existence over 10 millennia of silent service. The earliest confirmed deployment of what would become the Shadowkeepers occurred during the Horus Heresy itself, at the burning of Prospero. This event, one of the most controversial and tragic episodes of the heresy, saw the Space Wolves Legion, accompanied by elements of the Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence, descend upon the homeworld of the Thousand Sons Legion to punish them for the sorcery that the Emperor had forbidden at the Council of Nicaea. The involvement of the Shadowkeepers' predecessors, the Warders of the Vaults of Rhythan, while in this campaign is itself a point of some mystery within the lore. Several sodalities of these black-armored custodians were deployed as part of the Imperial Censure Host's Terran contingent, serving as the reserve second wave behind the lead elements commanded by Captain General Constantine Valdor himself. The fact that the Warders of Rhythan were pulled from their vigil over the Dark Cells and sent to Prospero suggests that the situation was more desperate than was outwardly understood at the time. These were Guardians who, by definition, should never have been redeployed. Their duty was too important, the risks too great. That they were sent to Prospero implies either that the threat posed by the Thousand Sons was judged to be of extraordinary magnitude, or that there were factors at play that the historical record does not fully capture. During the battle for Tizca, the capital city of Prospero, the Warder sodalities played a crucial role. They held their positions during the circling counterattacks launched by the Thousand Sons, resisting psychically augmented assaults that overwhelmed the merely human troops defending alongside them. The Thousand Sons were powerful psykers, each one capable of wielding the energies of the warp as a weapon, and the forces they brought to bear against the Imperial attackers were devastating. The Warders of Rhythan, with their specialized equipment and their long experience of standing against the influence of entities that operated through psychic and metaphysical means, were uniquely suited to endure these attacks. Where other soldiers broke or faltered, as the black-armored custodians held firm, their mental discipline and their warding technology protecting them from the worst of the Thousand Sons' psychic onslaught. After the burning of Prospero, the Warders of Rhythan returned to their vigil beneath the Imperial Palace. The Horus Heresy was about to enter its most terrible phase, and their presence at their posts would be needed more than ever. During the Siege of Terror itself, the Shadowkeepers' predecessors faced perhaps their most terrifying challenge. As the forces of chaos besieged the Imperial Palace from without, the entities imprisoned in the Dark Cells became increasingly agitated. The surge of chaos energy generated by the siege, the psychic screams of millions dying on the palace walls, the proximity of greater demonic entities summoned by the traitor forces, or all of these factors combined to create conditions that tested the wards and seals of the Dark Cells to their limits. The exact conditions within the Dark Cells during the Siege of Terror are not described in comprehensive detail in the lore, but we can piece together a picture from fragments scattered across multiple sources. What emerges is a picture of a secondary siege, one fought in silence and darkness, far below the apocalyptic battle raging on the surface. The inmates of the Dark Cells were, in many cases, beings of considerable psychic sensitivity. Even those that were not conventionally psychic were attuned to the currents of the warp in ways that transcended normal perceptual abilities. When the traitor legions began their assault on the Imperial Palace, when the warp itself began to bleed through the barriers of reality in response to the sheer concentration of psychic violence on the surface, the entities in the cells felt it. They felt the chaos energy surging through the foundations of the palace like an electromagnetic field, energizing a dormant machine. And they responded. The response varied from cell to cell, entity to entity. Some became active for the first time in centuries, their quiescent states disrupted by the influx of energy that permeated even the deepest levels of the prison complex. Others, already active, intensified their efforts to communicate with or influence the world beyond their containment. Still others underwent transformations that the warders of Rhython had never witnessed before, their forms or emissions changing in response to the chaos energy in ways that suggested an alarming degree of adaptability. The rune locks that sealed the most dangerous cells flickered and surged, their ancient mechanisms working overtime to compensate for the increased pressure from within. The psychic wards carved into the walls of the corridors glowed with an intensity that made the air itself feel heavy and oppressive. The temperature in the deep levels dropped dramatically, the environmental controls overwhelmed by the metaphysical cold that radiated from cells whose inmates were drawing energy from the surrounding environment in ways that defied conventional physics. And then the voices started. Not all of the entities in the dark cells communicated in ways that could be perceived as speech. But those that did used the opportunity of the siege to make their voices heard, projecting their words through the wards and seals with a force that they had never previously demonstrated. The warders stationed in the corridors reported hearing promises, threats, pleas, and laughter echoing from behind sealed doors, the sounds distorted by the containment systems but still intelligible enough to carry meaning. Some of the messages were directed at the warders themselves, attempts at persuasion or intimidation tailored to the individual psychologies of the guards. Others seemed to be communications between the inmates, coordinated exchanges that suggested a degree of cooperation between beings that had been isolated from each other for centuries. Consider what this must have been like for the warders stationed in those deep corridors. Above them, the greatest battle in human history raged. Their brothers fought and died on the walls of the palace, defending the emperor against the armies of the war master. Every instinct, every fiber of their being would have cried out for them to join the fight, to lend their formidable strength to the defense of their master. Instead, they remained at their posts because they understood what so few others did. If the things in the dark cells broke free while the palace was under siege, the battle above would become irrelevant. The horrors of old night, unleashed into a galaxy already torn apart by civil war and demonic incursion, would have ended not just the Imperium, but humanity itself. The closest the cells came to failure during the siege was on what the warders would later refer to, in their classified internal records, as the Night of Trembling. This was the night when Horus lowered the shields of his flagship, when the Emperor teleported aboard to confront his wayward son, when the psychic conflict between father and son sent shockwaves through the warp that were felt across the galaxy. On that night, every rune lock in the dark cells activated simultaneously, every ward blazed with white-hot intensity, and every containment system in the complex was pushed to the absolute limit of its design parameters. Several cells cracked, not breached, not opened, but cracked, hairline fractures appearing in seals that had been perfect for thousands of years. The warders responded with practiced efficiency, reinforcing the damaged seals with emergency containment protocols and standing ready with weapons drawn in case the worst should happen. It did not. Ere the seals held, the cracks were repaired, and the Night of Trembling passed into classified history, known only to the warders who had endured it and to the successors who inherited their burden. So they stood, they endured. They held the line against threats that no one above them even knew existed, and they did it alone, without reinforcement, without recognition, without hope of glory or remembrance. This is the essence of the Shadowkeepers. This is who they are. Not heroes who charge into battle with banners flying and war cries ringing. Silent sentinels who endure impossible burdens in the dark so that others might have a chance to fight in the light. In the millennia that followed the heresy, the warders of Rhython gradually transitioned into the formation known as the Shadowkeepers. As the organizational restructuring of the Adeptus Custodes, which occurred as part of the broader reorganization of the Imperium after the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne, formalized the shield host system and established the Shadowkeepers as a permanent, dedicated formation within the custodian hierarchy. The transition from warders to Shadowkeepers was not merely an administrative change. It reflected a deepening of the shield host's identity, a recognition that the duty they performed was not simply a military assignment, but a fundamental aspect of the Imperium's survival. The Warders of Rythan had been guardians of a specific location, the Vaults of Rythan. The Shadowkeepers were guardians of a concept, the concept that some things must be kept in darkness forever, that some knowledge is too dangerous to be shared, that some doors must never be opened regardless of what lies beyond them. This philosophical evolution was accompanied by practical changes in how the shield host operated. The Shadowkeepers developed new protocols for monitoring and maintaining the dark cells, drawing on the hard-won lessons of the heresy to create systems that were more resilient and more responsive to the kind of pressures that the siege had revealed. They established closer working relationships with the small number of tech adepts who were permitted to service the cell's mechanical and technological components. And they began to develop the psychological techniques and mental disciplines that would sustain them through the centuries of isolation and exposure to hostile psychic emanations that their duty demanded. The long millennia between the heresy and the Great Rift were not uneventful, despite what the sparse historical record might suggest. The cells required constant attention. The containment systems needed regular maintenance and occasional repair. New inmates arrived, sometimes brought in by custodian forces that had discovered threats too dangerous to be dealt with by any other means. And the existing inmates continued their endless, patient assault on the barriers that contained them, probing for weaknesses, testing the limits of their confinement, waiting for the opportunity that they knew, with the certainty of beings who measured time in millennia, would eventually come. For 10,000 years, the Shadowkeepers maintained their vigil. The galaxy convulsed with wars and catastrophes. Black crusades erupted from the Eye of Terror. Alien invasions threatened the borders of the Imperium. Internal rebellions, heretical uprisings, and bureaucratic collapse eroded the foundations of imperial governance. Through it all, the Shadowkeepers stood their watch, unaffected by and largely uninvolved in the grand sweep of galactic events. But that did not mean their vigil was uneventful. At some point between the 33rd and the 39th millennia, an exact date that remains classified, the halo belt augurs surrounding the Sol system detected something approaching terror from the dark void between the stars. A space hulk, one of those massive conglomerations of derelict vessels fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp, was advancing on a trajectory that would bring it dangerously close to the throne world. This in itself was not unusual. Space hulks drifted through the galaxy like metallic tumors, occasionally threatening inhabited systems and requiring the attention of the Imperial Navy or the Astartes to neutralize. But this space hulk was different. It was called the Ominous Gift, and there was something about it that alarmed the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes to a degree that transcended normal threat assessments. Captain General Asoth Kumadra, using his authority as a High Lord of Terror, overruled objections from the Imperial Navy and ordered a strike by several shield companies to gut the Ominous Gift from the inside and ensure that its corruption was wholly purged. The Imperial Navy's objections were not unreasonable. From their perspective, this was a standard Space Hulk clearance operation, the kind of mission that was typically handled by Space Marine chapters, particularly the Death Watch, or those chapters with extensive experience in void warfare. Committing custodian shield companies to such a task seemed, to the Navy's admirals, like using a master-crafted power sword to cut bread. It was excessive, it was wasteful, and it raised uncomfortable questions about why the Captain General considered this particular threat worthy of the Emperor's own guardians. Kumadra did not explain his reasoning. He did not need to. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes answers to no one but the Emperor himself, and his authority in matters of Terra's defense is absolute. The admirals registered their objections, and the objections were noted and ignored, and the custodian shield companies were deployed without further discussion. The attack was led by the Lock Warden of the Shadowkeepers. This detail is crucial, and it tells us everything we need to know about the nature of the threat. The Lock Warden, the supreme guardian of the Dark Cells, does not leave their post for trivial matters. The Lock Warden does not participate in routine military operations or standard threat responses. If the Lock Warden personally led the assault on the ominous gift, it means that whatever the Space Hulk contained was directly relevant to the Shadowkeepers' mission. It means that somewhere within that drifting mass of fused starships, there was something that belonged in the Dark Cells, or something that had escaped from them, or something that posed a comparable level of threat to the things already imprisoned beneath the Imperial Palace. Or we can only speculate about what the Custodians found aboard the ominous gift. The records, if they exist at all, are sealed beyond the reach of even the most determined inquirer. But consider the name, the ominous gift. In the Warhammer 40,000 setting, names carry weight, and a Space Hulk's name often reflects the nature of the threat it represents. A gift implies something that was offered, something that was presented with the appearance of generosity, but with a hidden and malicious purpose. An ominous gift is one that carries with it the promise of harm, a Trojan horse drifting through the void. Was the ominous gift deliberately aimed at terror? Was it sent by some intelligence, some force that wanted whatever it carried to reach the throne world? Was the Space Hulk itself a delivery system, or a vehicle designed to penetrate the Sol system's defenses by disguising its true nature behind the apparent randomness of a drifting derelict? We do not know. We cannot know because the Shadowkeepers have ensured that the answers are buried as deeply as the horrors in the Dark Cells themselves. But the very fact that the question can be asked tells us something about the nature of the threats the Shadowkeepers face. Their enemies are not always obvious. They do not always announce themselves with the blaring of war horns and the firing of weapons. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as debris, masked as chance, presenting themselves as gifts that are anything but. The ominous gift was destroyed. The wider Imperium was told nothing beyond that basic fact. At those outside the Adeptus Custodes did not understand the significance of the operation, and the Shadowkeepers made no effort to enlighten them. The secret was kept, as the Shadowkeepers' secrets always were, locked away in the darkness alongside everything else they guarded. This incident, minor as it might seem in the grand sweep of galactic history, perfectly encapsulates the Shadowkeepers' modus operandi. They identified a threat. They responded to it with overwhelming force and absolute secrecy. They neutralized the threat and returned to their vigil, leaving no trace of their involvement and no explanation for their actions. This is how the Shadowkeepers have operated for 10,000 years, moving through the shadows of the Imperium like ghosts, intervening only when something touches upon their ancient mandate, and disappearing again when their work is done. But the ominous gift incident also raises a deeper and more troubling question. How many other such incidents have occurred over the course of 10 millennia? How many threats have the Shadowkeepers neutralized in silence, without the knowledge or involvement of any other Imperial institution? How many times has the Lock Warden left their post, led their warriors into battle against threats that the wider Imperium never knew existed, and returned to the Dark Cells with secrets that added to an already staggering burden of forbidden knowledge? The answer, almost certainly, is more times than anyone outside the Shadowkeepers themselves could guess. The history of the Dark Cells is not a history of static containment. It is a history of active defense, of constant vigilance, and of quiet interventions that have preserved the Imperium from threats it never knew it faced. And the Shadowkeepers have carried the weight of that history alone, adding each new secret to the pile, each new burden to their shoulders, each new nightmare to the darkness that surrounds them. In the 41st millennium, A period known as the Years of Madness engulfed Terra. This era of strange omens and ominous whispers began with the disappearance of the notoriously conservative Captain General Galahoth, and escalated into a full-blown crisis that tested the Custodians in ways they had not been tested in centuries. Cult activity surged throughout the Sol system, both heretical and xenophile in nature. Doomsday sects triggered violent conflicts between the pilgrim tribes that crowded the corridors of the Imperial Palace, while the Custodians were forced to exercise their authority in the bloodiest engagements they had seen in living memory. The surface of Terra during this period was a simmering cauldron of paranoia and violence. The pilgrim roads that led to the Eternity Gate, normally clogged with devoted masses shuffling toward the holiest shrine in the Imperium, became killing grounds where rival sects turned on each other with the viciousness of cornered animals. The underhives boiled with cult activity. Strange symbols appeared on the walls of hab blocks, scratched into metal and stone by hands that moved with feverish purpose. Astropaths reported receiving transmissions that consisted of nothing but screaming, endless and sourceless, coming from no identifiable point in the warp. The Custodians responded as they always did, with overwhelming force and absolute precision. But even the 10,000 found themselves stretched thin by the sheer scale of the crisis. It was not a single enemy they were fighting, not a coordinated assault that could be defeated through tactical brilliance and martial supremacy. It was a madness, a creeping infection of the spirit that seemed to touch every corner of the throne world simultaneously, turning citizens against each other and feeding on the resulting bloodshed. But the most disturbing reports came from the dark cells. The Shadowkeepers reported a growing sense of agitation among the hidden inmates. The entities and artifacts imprisoned in the cells had always exerted a palpable psychic pressure on their surroundings, but during the Years of Madness, that pressure intensified dramatically. When something was changing in the deep places beneath the palace, something was stirring, responding to the turmoil on the surface in ways that the Shadowkeepers found deeply alarming. The nature of this agitation is difficult to convey without understanding the baseline condition of the dark cells. Under normal circumstances, the cells are not silent. They have never been silent. The entities within them exert a constant, low-level pressure on their surroundings, a psychic background noise that the Shadowkeepers have learned to live with over the centuries. It is the sound of things pressing against their containment, testing the walls, probing the wards, searching for weaknesses with the patient persistence of water wearing away stone. The Shadowkeepers have become so accustomed to this pressure that they can detect minute variations in its intensity, can identify individual sources within the complex, can read the mood of the cells, the way a farmer reads the weather. During the Years of Madness, that background noise became a roar. The entities in the cells were not merely testing their containment. They were pushing against it, straining with a unified intensity that the Shadowkeepers had never experienced before. It was as if the madness on the surface was feeding them, strengthening them, giving them energy and purpose that their millennia of imprisonment had slowly eroded. The rune locks that sealed the cells burned with a feverish light that hurt to look upon. The wards etched into the walls seemed to shimmer and distort, as if the symbols were fighting to maintain their integrity against a force that was actively trying to rewrite them. And in the deepest levels, where the most dangerous entities were contained, the Shadowkeepers reported hearing sounds that should not have been possible, sounds that seemed to bypass their enhanced hearing and register directly in their minds, sounds that carried meaning without words, conveying concepts and intentions that no human language could express. Worse still, the support servitors assigned to the dark cells began to malfunction. These were specialized servitors, cybernetic constructs designed to perform maintenance and logistical tasks in the prison complex. They had been lobotomized, their higher brain functions stripped away to prevent them from being influenced by the psychic emanations of the cell's inmates. But during the Years of Madness, even these precautions proved insufficient. The servitors began to exhibit sudden, violent madness attacking without provocation, screaming in voices that were not their own, and displaying behaviors that suggested external influence of a deeply unnatural kind. Some servitors were found wandering corridors they had no reason to be in, their mechanical limbs carrying them toward specific cells, as if drawn by some invisible force. Others were discovered attempting to interfere with the locking mechanisms of the cells they were responsible for maintaining, their lobotomized brains somehow receiving and acting upon instructions from sources that should not have been able to reach them. The Shadowkeepers were forced to destroy numerous servitors, each incident adding to the growing sense that something terrible was building in the depths. The implications of the servitor malfunctions were perhaps the most frightening aspect of the entire crisis. If the entities in the cells could reach the minds of lobotomized servitors, beings whose higher cognitive functions had been deliberately destroyed to prevent exactly this kind of manipulation, then the wards and seals that contained them were not functioning as intended. Something was leaking through, some influence or emanation that was bypassing the containment systems and affecting the world outside the cells. The Shadowkeepers were not merely dealing with agitated inmates. They were dealing with a potential containment failure, a scenario in which the barriers between the horrors of the cells and the wider world were beginning to degrade. The years of madness eventually passed, though not before claiming the life of Captain General Andros Launchedra, who was led to his death by the false predictions of possessed doomscryers. The crisis was contained, the cults were purged, and the surface of terror returned to something resembling normalcy. But the Shadowkeepers knew that the agitation in the dark cells had not truly subsided. It had merely retreated, pulling back like a tide that would inevitably return, stronger and more dangerous than before. The years between the end of the years of madness and the opening of the Great Rift were, for the Shadowkeepers, a period of dread anticipation. They had seen the cells at their most volatile, and they had watched the containment systems strain under pressures that exceeded anything in their previous experience. They had been forced to kill their own servitors, beings that should have been immune to external influence, because the influence of the cell's inmates had reached even into lobotomized brains. They knew, with the cold certainty of warriors who had spent centuries reading the moods of their charges, that what they had experienced was not a climax, but a prelude. Something worse was coming. Something far worse. They were right. The tide was coming, and when it arrived, it would come not as a gradual swelling, but as a sudden, catastrophic flood that would change the Shadowkeepers forever. The event that shattered 10,000 years of stability was the Battle of Lion's Gate. In the closing days of the 41st Millennium, as the galaxy was already in turmoil, the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon the Despoiler's greatest assault on the Imperium, had culminated in the destruction of Cadia, the fortress world that had guarded the only stable route out of the Eye of Terror for millennia. With Cadia gone, the Eye of Terror began to expand without limit, and the fabric of reality itself began to tear. The Great Rift, an immense warp storm that would eventually stretch from one end of the galaxy to the other, was being born. On Terra, the consequences were immediate and devastating. A vast horde of cornate demons, bloodthirsty servants of the Blood God, tore through the barrier between the warp and reality and launched a savage assault on the Lion's Gate of the Imperial Palace. This was what became known informally as the Second Battle of Terror, and a conflict that echoed the horrors of the Siege of Terror 10,000 years earlier. Legions of howling demons surged toward the palace walls, and a desperate battle ensued as the Custodians, alongside the reborn Primarch Reboot Gilliman and his Ultramarines, fought to repel the invasion. Lockwarden Borsa Thursk, confronted with the most direct threat to the Imperial Palace since the Horus Heresy, made a decision that would have consequences far beyond the immediate battle. He ordered many of the Shadowkeepers to leave the dark cells and join the defense of the Lion's Gate. This was not a decision made lightly. The Shadowkeepers' entire purpose was to guard the dark cells. To leave those cells undermanned was to accept a risk of almost incomprehensible magnitude, but Thursk understood that if the palace fell, the dark cells would be breached regardless. Better to commit his forces to the defense of the walls and preserve the integrity of the palace as a whole than to huddle in the depths, while the world burned above them. The Shadowkeepers fought with the terrifying efficiency that their millennia of service had honed to a razor edge. Even among the Custodians, they stood out for the cold, relentless precision of their combat style, a reflection of the patience and discipline that their endless vigil had instilled in them. But while the Shadowkeepers fought on the surface, the dark cells were left with only a handful of guardians. And in that moment of vulnerability, disaster struck. When the Great Rift finally tore open, flooding the galaxy with raw chaos energy, the effects reached even into the sealed depths beneath the Imperial Palace. Yes, the wards trembled, the rune locks flickered, and in the darkness, things began to move. When Thirsk led his forces back to the dark cells after the battle was won, he found a scene of horror. Several of the cells stood empty. The entities and artifacts that had been imprisoned within them had vanished, spirited away by forces unknown, their seals broken and their wards shattered. The Shadowkeepers who had remained behind to guard the cells were dead, slain by whatever had broken free or by the forces that had engineered the escape. For 10,000 years, the dark cells had held. Through the Horus heresy, through the Reign of Blood, through 13 Black Crusades and countless other catastrophes, the cells had remained inviolate. Now, for the first time in the Imperium's history, their contents were loose in the galaxy. But the horror of this realization cannot be overstated. The things that had escaped were not ordinary threats. They were the nightmares of old night, beings and artifacts of such terrible power that the Emperor himself had judged them too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely. They were now out there, somewhere in a galaxy already tearing itself apart, free to wreak whatever havoc they chose upon a humanity that had no idea they existed and no means to defend against them. For Lockwarden, Borsa Thirsk, the failure was personal and absolute. His decision to commit the Shadowkeepers to the defense of the Lion's Gate had left the cells vulnerable. His warriors had died on his watch. His prisoners had escaped on his orders. The weight of that responsibility would have crushed a lesser being. But Thirsk was a custodian. Us and custodians do not break under the weight of failure. They adapt, they endure, and they act. The immediate aftermath of the discovery must have been a scene of controlled urgency that belied the magnitude of the disaster. The Shadowkeepers, who had survived the Battle of Lion's Gate, warriors who had minutes earlier been fighting demonic hordes on the surface of Terra, now found themselves moving through the corridors of the dark cells with weapons drawn and sensors at maximum sensitivity, cataloguing the damage with the systematic thoroughness that their training demanded. Each empty cell was a wound. Each broken seal was a failure. Each dead Shadowkeeper found in the corridors, killed by forces that had overwhelmed even their formidable defenses, was a brother lost and a testament to the terrible power of the things that had walked free. The process of assessment must have taken days, possibly weeks, as the surviving Shadowkeepers worked their way through all 81 levels, checking every cell, testing every ward, verifying the status of every inmate. And with each empty cell they found, the scope of the disaster became clearer. These were not minor threats that had escaped. The entities that had broken free were among the most dangerous in the complex, beings whose containment had been maintained for millennia through the most extreme measures available to the Imperium. Now they were loose in a galaxy that had no idea they existed and possessed no means to defend against them. The weight of that knowledge settled onto the Shadowkeepers like a physical burden, whilst pressing down on warriors who were already exhausted from the battle above and from the discovery below. But there was no time for grief, no space for recrimination, no luxury of dwelling on what had gone wrong. There was only the question of what to do next. Thirsk ordered a retreat from the surface, abandoning any further involvement in the ongoing battle to focus entirely on assessing the damage to the dark cells and determining what had escaped. When the full extent of the breach became clear, Thirsk made another decision, one that was in many ways even more momentous than his choice to join the Battle of Lion's Gate. For the first time since the burning of Prospero, the Shadowkeepers would deploy en masse beyond the walls of the Imperial Palace. For the first time in 10,000 years, as the black-armored guardians of the Dark Cells would venture out into the galaxy, not as warriors seeking battle, but as jailers seeking to recapture their escaped prisoners. The Shadowkeepers became hunters. This was a fundamental transformation in the nature of the Shield host, a metamorphosis as profound in its way as the Great Rift itself. For their entire existence, the Shadowkeepers had been defined by their static, defensive role. They stood watch, they guarded, they endured. The corridors of the Dark Cells had been their world, the sealed doors their horizon, the slow pulse of containment fields their clock. They had measured their existence in the rhythms of patrol routes and maintenance cycles, in the subtle fluctuations of psychic pressure that told them whether their charges were quiescent or restless. And now all of that was shattered. The quiet, controlled world of the Dark Cells had been breached, and the Shadowkeepers were forced to adapt to an entirely new paradigm. Instead of waiting for the darkness to come to them, they would go to the darkness. Instead of standing still, they would move. Instead of guarding, they would pursue, track, capture, and contain. They would cross the galaxy if necessary, following the trails of escaped entities and lost artifacts wherever those trails might lead, slaughtering anyone who attempted to impede their mission and returning their quarry to the cells where it belonged. It speaks volumes about the dire condition of the galaxy that Thirsk, who had left Terra only twice before the breaking of the storm, has barely set foot on the throne world since the Great Rift opened. The Lockwarden, yet the Guardian who should never leave his post, has been forced to become a galactic operative, traveling from one crisis to another as the consequences of the Dark Cells breach continue to unfold. The missions that the Shadowkeepers now undertake are shrouded in the same secrecy that has always characterized their operations. They appear without warning, descend upon their targets with overwhelming force, and vanish again when their objective is achieved. They do not explain their actions. They do not coordinate with other Imperial forces unless absolutely necessary. They operate under their own authority, answerable only to the Captain General, and through him, to the Emperor himself. There is one relationship that deserves special mention before we continue, and that is the connection between the Shadowkeepers and the Sisters of Silence. The Sisters, the Anathema Psychana, are the Emperor's anti-psychic warriors, beings known as blanks or nulls, whose very presence dampens and suppresses psychic energy. Their nature makes them the natural complement to the Custodians in any operation involving psychic threats, and the partnership between the two organizations dates back to the earliest days of the Imperium. For the Shadowkeepers, the Sisters of Silence are more than allies. They are essential partners in the containment effort. Many of the entities imprisoned in the Dark Cells operate through psychic or quasi-psychic means, and the presence of blanks serves as an additional layer of suppression that reinforces the rune locks and warding systems. Sisters of Silence have been assigned to duty in the Dark Cells since the earliest days of the facility's operation, their null auras providing a living barrier against the psychic emanations of the inmates. The dynamic between the Shadowkeepers and the Sisters assigned to the Dark Cells is unique within the Imperium's military structure. Both groups operate under conditions of extreme secrecy and isolation. Both bear the psychological burden of prolonged exposure to entities of terrible power, and both share a dedication to their duty that transcends personal comfort or individual ambition. The bond between them is not the loud, demonstrative brotherhood of space marines, but something quieter and deeper, a shared understanding born of standing together in the dark against horrors that no one else can see. Shown when the Shadowkeepers transitioned from static guardians to active hunters after the Great Rift, elements of the Sisters of Silence accompanied them. Their null auras proved invaluable in tracking and containing escaped entities, particularly those that relied on psychic abilities to evade detection. A Shadowkeeper hunting party accompanied by Sisters of Silence is a containment force of extraordinary capability, combining the Custodians' unmatched martial prowess with the Sisters' psychic suppression to create a team that can engage and neutralize threats that would be beyond the capability of either group operating alone. One of the most intriguing of these post-Rift operations was dispatched to the ruins of Cadia. Upon the direct orders of Captain General Trajan Valoris, a small, yet fast-moving force of Custodians made haste for the shattered remains of the fortress world that had once guarded the entrance to the Eye of Terror. The details of their mission were suppressed even among their own comrades, but the force was accompanied by warriors drawn from the ranks of the Shadowkeepers. Why Cadia? What could possibly exist among the ruins of a destroyed world that would warrant the attention of the Shadowkeepers? The lore does not tell us, and that silence is itself a statement. Whatever the Shadowkeepers sought on Cadia, it was important enough to draw the personal attention of the Captain General, and sensitive enough that even the Custodians themselves were not told the full details. 1. The involvement of the Shadowkeepers suggests that whatever was on Cadia was either something that had escaped from the Dark Cells, or something that belonged in them, an artifact or entity of sufficient power and danger to warrant the attention of the Imperium's most secret guardians. Perhaps even more remarkable was the Shadowkeepers' involvement in the restoration of the Phalanx. The Phalanx is the mobile fortress monastery of the Imperial Fist Space Marine chapter, a vessel of staggering size and power that is believed to have been constructed during the Dark Age of technology. By the time of the Indomitus Crusade, the Phalanx was badly damaged, much of its ancient technology non-functional or decayed beyond repair. The vessel had served heroically during the 13th Black Crusade, leading the evacuation fleet from the dying world of Cadia. But the cost had been enormous. In an act that the lore describes as one of solidarity, the Shadowkeepers opened one of their dark cells and provided the Imperial Fists with secret technology that had been kept hidden within the bowels of the Imperial Palace. This technology gave the Sons of Rogel Dawn a chance to restore the Phalanx to a level of operational readiness that had not been seen in centuries, possibly millennia. Think about what this means. The Shadowkeepers voluntarily opened one of their cells, those same cells whose security they had guarded with fanatical devotion for 10,000 years, and released something from within it. Whatever they gave the Imperial Fists was technology from the Dark Age. A technology so advanced and so powerful that it could restore a vessel the size of a small moon to functional capacity that the Adeptus Mechanicus, with all its vast technical knowledge, had been unable to achieve. This act tells us several important things about the Shadowkeepers and the Dark Cells. First, it confirms that not everything in the cells is a weapon or a monster. Some of the technology imprisoned there is potentially beneficial but has been locked away because the risks of its use were judged to outweigh the benefits. Second, it shows that the Shadowkeepers, despite their reputation for absolute secrecy and implacable rigidity, are capable of making pragmatic decisions in response to changing circumstances. The restoration of the Phalanx served the defense of Terra, and therefore served the Shadowkeepers' broader mission. Yet the galaxy had changed, and the Shadowkeepers changed with it. Third, and perhaps most intriguingly, it suggests that the Shadowkeepers' knowledge of what is in the Dark Cells is far more detailed and nuanced than outsiders might assume. They did not simply crack open a random cell and hand over whatever was inside. They identified a specific piece of technology that was suited to a specific purpose and released it in a controlled, deliberate manner. This implies a level of cataloging and understanding that goes beyond mere imprisonment. The Shadowkeepers do not just guard the Dark Cells, they study them. They understand their contents, to whatever degree understanding is possible, when dealing with technology and entities from an age that has been lost to time and myth. This expanded role of the Shadowkeepers in the era Indomitus represents perhaps the most significant evolution in their 10,000-year history. They have gone from being purely defensive guardians, standing watch over a static collection of horrors, to active operatives, ranging across the galaxy to recover escaped prisoners, capture new threats, and, when necessary, release controlled amounts of the power they guard to serve the Imperium's needs. They are still the wardens of the dark cells. That has not changed, and it will never change. But they are now something more as well. They are the galaxy's first and last line of defense against threats that most of the Imperium does not even know exist. Hunters who move through the shadows of a burning galaxy, seeking out horrors that could end civilization itself if left unchecked. And they do it all in silence, in secrecy, without recognition or reward, because that is what the Shadowkeepers have always done. That is what it means to guard the darkness. Before we move on to the Shadowkeepers' combat doctrine, there is another thread of their story that deserves thorough exploration. It is the thread of what the Shadowkeepers know and what that knowledge does to the warriors who carry it. Because the Shadowkeepers are not merely physical guardians. They are intellectual custodians of forbidden information, keepers of truths so dangerous that even the act of knowing them represents a form of sacrifice. Every custodian who is inducted into the Shadowkeepers undergoes a process of revelation that is unlike anything else in the Adeptus Custodes. They are told things, shown things, made to understand the nature of the threats they will be guarding against, not in the abstract but in specific horrifying detail. They learn the names of things that should not have names. They study the histories of entities that predate human civilization. They are briefed on the capabilities of weapons that could unravel the fundamental laws of physics, and they are made to understand exactly what would happen if those weapons were ever activated. This process is necessary. You cannot guard something you do not understand. A sentinel who does not know what they are protecting cannot make informed decisions about how to respond to threats. The Shadowkeepers need to know what is in the cells so that they can recognize the warning signs of a containment breach, so that they can prioritize their responses if multiple cells are threatened simultaneously, and so that they can, if the worst comes to pass, deploy the correct countermeasures against whatever has broken free. But this knowledge comes at a cost. There are things in the human mind, and even in the transhuman mind of a custodian, that are not designed to hold certain categories of information. The architecture of consciousness, no matter how reinforced and enhanced, has limits. And some of the truths contained in the dark cells press against those limits in ways that leave permanent marks. The Shadowkeepers do not go mad. Their mental fortitude is too great for that. But they change. There is a quality to a veteran Shadowkeeper that other custodians notice and find difficult to describe. A distance, a weight, something in the eyes. If you could see their eyes behind the black lenses of their war helms, that speaks of knowledge too heavy to carry and too vital to set down. The other custodians respect the Shadowkeepers, but they also keep a certain distance from them, not out of fear or suspicion, but out of an instinctive recognition that the Shadowkeepers have seen things that no being should have to see, and that the seeing has left its mark. This is another dimension of the Shadowkeepers' sacrifice, one that is often overlooked in discussions of their lore. They do not merely risk their lives in the line of duty. They risk something more fundamental. They risk their understanding of reality itself, exposing their minds to concepts and entities that challenge the basic assumptions upon which consciousness is built. And they do this willingly, knowingly, because the alternative is to leave the dark cells in the hands of guardians who do not fully understand what they are guarding. There is a phrase that circulates among the Custodians for this kind of sacrifice. It refers to the price paid by those who must look directly at the things that others are protected from knowing about. The Shadowkeepers bear this burden more heavily than any other formation in the Adeptus Custodes, and they bear it in silence, because to speak of it would be to share the knowledge that they are sworn to contain. Consider, too, the implications of the Shadowkeepers' knowledge for their psychological well-being over the long centuries and millennia of their service. A custodian can live for thousands of years, barring death in battle. That is thousands of years carrying the knowledge of what lurks beneath the palace, thousands of years of knowing that humanity's past achievements nearly destroyed the species, Thousands of years of standing watch over entities that whisper at the edges of consciousness, probing for weaknesses, testing the mental defenses of their jailers with the patient malice of beings that have nothing but time. The mental discipline required to endure this for even a single century would be extraordinary. To endure it for millennia requires something beyond discipline. It requires a fundamental commitment to purpose that transcends ordinary motivation. The Shadowkeepers do not stand their watch because they enjoy it, or because they find it fulfilling, or even because they believe in the abstract rightness of their cause. They stand their watch because they have internalized their duty so completely that it has become indistinguishable from their identity. They are not warriors who guard the dark cells. They are the guardians of the dark cells, and that distinction, subtle though it may seem, makes all the difference. This internalization of purpose is what allows the Shadowkeepers to endure where lesser beings would crumble. It is what allows them to stand in the dark, surrounded by horror, and remain steadfast. It is what makes them, in the final analysis, the right choice for this impossible duty. Not because they are the strongest or the most skilled, though they are both of those things, but because they are the most committed, the most unwavering, the most absolutely and irrevocably dedicated to their purpose. And this is why the Lock Warden's title carries such weight among the 10,000. To be named Lock Warden is to be recognized as the being most capable of bearing the heaviest burden in the Custodian arsenal. Not the heaviest weapon, not the heaviest armor, but the heaviest knowledge. The Lock Warden knows everything. The Lock Warden carries the full weight of 10,000 years of accumulated horror in their mind. Every name, every history, every capability of every entity and artifact imprisoned in the 81 levels of the dark cells. And the Lock Warden stands firm under that weight, year after year, century after century, because that is what the title demands. Borsa Thursk has borne this weight for a century and a half. In 150 years of carrying knowledge that would shatter the mind of any ordinary human and severely test the sanity of even a space marine. 150 years of being the final authority on the most dangerous secrets in the Imperium, the last voice that decides whether a cell should remain sealed or whether, in the direst of circumstances, its contents might be released to serve the Imperium's needs. The decision to provide the Imperial fists with Dark Age technology to restore the Phalanx was one such moment. Thursk, or whoever made that decision in the Shadowkeepers' chain of command, had to weigh the risk of releasing a piece of contained technology against the strategic benefit of restoring one of the Imperium's most powerful military assets. That is the kind of calculation that the Lock Warden must make, balancing existential risks against strategic necessities, measuring the danger of a known quantity against the danger of an undefended galaxy. These are decisions that no one else in the Imperium is qualified to make, because no one else has the knowledge necessary to make them. This is the loneliest aspect of the Lock Warden's duty, and it is the aspect that most clearly illustrates the fundamental nature of the Shadowkeepers' sacrifice. They do not merely guard, they decide, and the weight of those decisions, carried alone in the darkness, is perhaps the heaviest burden of all. Let us now turn our attention to the wider context of the Shadowkeepers within the Adeptus Custodes and the changes wrought by the return of Roboute Guilliman to the galactic stage. And when the Primarch of the Ultramarines was resurrected during the Gathering Storm and made his way back to Terra through the Terran Crusade, his arrival marked the beginning of a new era for the Imperium. Guilliman was appalled by the state of the civilization his father had built. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium was a grotesque reflection of the Emperor's original vision, a theocratic nightmare riven by internal corruption, technological regression, and a fundamental inability to adapt to the changing threats that beset it on every front. Among the many changes Guilliman enacted during his early tenure as Lord Commander and Imperial Regent, one of the most significant for the Adeptus Custodes was a formal amendment to their role. In a meeting held behind locked doors, shielded by complex wards and layers of psychic protection, Guilliman and Captain General Trajan Valoris ratified an agreement that would fundamentally alter the way the Custodians operated. The Imperial Palace would still be guarded. The Companions would still maintain their vigil around the Golden Throne, but the Custodians would now commit to greatly extending their extrasolar activities, deploying shield hosts beyond Terra to identify and eliminate the most deadly threats to the Emperor's safety before those threats could reach the throne world. For the Shadowkeepers, this amendment had a complex and nuanced impact. On one hand, their primary duty remained unchanged. The Dark Cells still needed guarding, and the Shadowkeepers were still the only formation qualified to do so. On the other hand, the breach that occurred during the Battle of Lion's Gate had already forced them out of their purely defensive posture. The amendment simply formalized what was already happening, giving the Shadowkeepers official sanction to pursue their escaped prisoners across the galaxy. But it also meant something more. It meant that the Shadowkeepers, historically the most insular and secretive of the shield hosts, would now be operating in the wider galaxy alongside other Imperial forces. They would be seen by Astra Militarum regiments, by Space Marine chapters, by Inquisitors and rogue traders, and all the myriad factions that make up the Imperium's vast and fractious military apparatus. And every one of those encounters would raise questions that the Shadowkeepers were not prepared to answer. What are black-armored Custodians doing here? What are they looking for? Why do they move with such grim purpose, such singular focus, as if driven by a need that transcends ordinary military objectives? Why do they refuse to explain their mission, refuse to coordinate with local commanders, refuse to acknowledge any authority save their own? The answers to these questions are, of course, classified at the highest possible level, and the Shadowkeepers make no effort to provide them. They arrive, they accomplish their objective, and they leave. If anyone gets in their way, the consequences are severe and immediate. The Shadowkeepers do not threaten. They do not negotiate. They simply act with the same cold, implacable efficiency that characterizes everything they do. This has led to a number of tense encounters between the Shadowkeepers and other Imperial forces. As Space Marine chapters, accustomed to operating as the senior military authority in whatever theater they are deployed to, find themselves confronted by warriors who not only refuse to defer to their leadership, but who possess the authority to override any military commander in the Imperium. Inquisitors, used to wielding nearly absolute power in pursuit of their own investigations, discover that there are secrets even they are not permitted to access. Doors even their rosettes cannot open. The result is a reputation that precedes the Shadowkeepers wherever they go. They are spoken of in hushed tones by those who have encountered them. They are feared, not in the way that a dread host force is feared, with the visceral terror of impending destruction, but in a more subtle, more insidious way. The Shadowkeepers represent the unknown. They are the Imperium's own darkness, the shadow cast by the Emperor's light, and their presence is always an indicator that something terrible is at stake, something that the wider Imperium cannot be permitted to know about. This reputation serves the Shadowkeepers' purposes well. Fear and uncertainty are powerful tools, and the Shadowkeepers wield them as effectively as they wield their Guardian Spears and Castellan Axes. A planetary governor who receives word that the Shadowkeepers are operating in his system is a governor who will think twice about interfering with their mission, regardless of whatever else might be happening in his domain. A Space Marine, chapter master who encounters a black-armored Custodian, will extend every courtesy and provide whatever assistance is requested. Because the alternative is to obstruct a direct agent of the Emperor himself, and no chapter master, no matter how proud, wants to invite that particular storm upon their brothers. But the Shadowkeepers' expanded presence in the galaxy also creates risks. Every deployment beyond Terra is a deployment that draws resources away from the Dark Cells. Every Shadowkeeper sent on a reclamation mission is a Shadowkeeper who is not standing watch in the corridors beneath the palace. The balance between maintaining the security of the cells and pursuing escaped prisoners across the galaxy is one that the Lock Warden must constantly manage, and it is a balance that has no perfect solution. Thirsk has dealt with this by rotating his forces, sending small, focused strike teams on specific missions while maintaining a core garrison at the Dark Cells. But the numbers are always tight. 100 custodians, give or take, sounds like a lot until you consider that they are responsible for 81 levels of cells, each containing horrors that require constant monitoring, plus an unknown number of reclamation missions scattered across a galaxy that is more dangerous and more chaotic than it has been at any point since the Horus heresy. This is the new reality of the Shadowkeepers in the era Indomitus. They are stretched thinner than they have ever been, facing demands that their founders never anticipated, operating in an environment that has changed more dramatically in the last few centuries than it changed in the preceding 10 millennia. And yet, they adapt, as they have always adapted, because the alternative is to fail. And failure, for the Shadowkeepers, means the end of everything. Yet let us now explore some of the specific engagements and missions that illustrate the Shadowkeepers' expanded role in the era Indomitus, drawing on the fragments of information that have filtered through the layers of secrecy to reach the wider lore. The mission to Cadia's remains, which we touched upon earlier, deserves more detailed examination. Captain General Trajan Valoris personally ordered this operation, which tells us immediately that it was considered a matter of the highest priority. Valoris is not a being who micromanages routine operations. If the Captain General issued direct orders for a specific mission, it means that the stakes were extraordinary, even by the standards of the Custodians. The force dispatched was described as small and fast-moving, suggesting an operation that prioritized speed and stealth over firepower. Yet this was not a military assault. This was a search and recovery mission, the kind of delicate, precision operation that the Shadowkeepers excel at. They were looking for something specific, something whose location on the ruins of Cadia had been determined through intelligence channels that we are not privy to. The fact that the mission's details were suppressed even among the Custodians' own comrades tells us that whatever they sought on Cadia was not merely classified, but actively dangerous to know about. Information containment is a core competency of the Shadowkeepers, and they applied it here with their usual thoroughness. Only those who needed to know were told, and even they were given only the minimum information necessary to accomplish their roles. What could have been on Cadia that warranted this level of response? Yes, Cadia was a fortress world, yes, but it was primarily a military installation designed to guard the Cadian Gate. It did not, as far as the wider lore tells us, harbor Dark Age relics or imprisoned entities on the scale of the Dark Cell's contents. However, Cadia also had a unique relationship with the warp, being located at the very edge of the Eye of Terror and studded with ancient pylons of unknown Necron origin that suppressed warp activity in the surrounding region. When Cadia was destroyed, those pylons were shattered, and the Great Rift, which the pylons might have been capable of preventing, or at least containing, tore across the galaxy. It is possible, and this is speculation clearly labeled as such, that the destruction of Cadia released something that had been contained by the pylons, and something that the Shadowkeepers needed to recover before it could fall into the wrong hands. Or perhaps the Shadowkeepers had information suggesting that one of their escaped prisoners had been drawn to the ruins of Cadia by the residual warp energies that saturated the remains of the fortress world. Whatever the truth, the mission to Cadia represents the kind of operation that has become the Shadowkeepers' new normal. Rapid deployment, total secrecy, singular focus on the objective, and an absolute refusal to share information with anyone who does not have a direct need to know. Another significant operation involved the Shadowkeepers' interaction with the Imperial Fists regarding the Phalanx, which we discussed earlier in terms of the technology transfer. But there is more to this story than a simple act of generosity. Lest the Shadowkeepers did not give the Imperial Fists a gift, they made a strategic investment. The Phalanx, restored to operational capability by the Dark Age technology provided by the Shadowkeepers, now operates at a level of readiness that has not been seen in centuries or even millennia. it has become a key strategic asset in the defense of Terra, serving as the headquarters of Lord Commander Solar Arcadian Leontus during the Fourth Tyrannic War. But the Shadowkeepers' involvement did not end with the technology transfer. There are reports, oblique and unconfirmed, as is always the case with Shadowkeeper operations, that a contingent of Custodians now maintains a presence aboard the Phalanx. Whether these Custodians are Shadowkeepers specifically is unclear, but the timing and circumstances of their arrival are suggestive. And if the Shadowkeepers do have operatives aboard the Phalanx, it would serve multiple purposes. It would allow them to monitor the Dark Age technology they released, ensuring that it is being used as intended and that no unforeseen consequences have arisen from its deployment. It would give them a forward operating base for missions in the Sol system and beyond, reducing the logistical burden of deploying from Terra for every operation. And it would provide them with a degree of influence over one of the Imperium's most powerful military assets, ensuring that the Phalanx serves the Emperor's purposes as the Shadowkeepers understand them. This kind of strategic thinking is characteristic of the Shadowkeepers, and indeed of the Custodians as a whole. They do not think in terms of individual battles or campaigns, yet they think in terms of centuries and millennia, of long-term threats and enduring strategic positions. Every action they take is calculated not just for its immediate effect, but for its implications over the coming decades and centuries. This is the mindset of beings who have been guarding against existential threats for 10,000 years. And it is a mindset that serves them well in the chaotic, rapidly changing environment of the era Indomitus. The Shadowkeepers' expanded operations have also brought them into contact with threats that are entirely new, threats that were not imprisoned in the Dark Cells, but that have emerged as a consequence of the Great Rift's opening. The flood of raw chaos energy that accompanied the Rift's creation has stirred things to life that were previously dormant. Ancient weapons have been activated. Dormant entities have awakened. Technologies that were sealed away in forgotten vaults across the galaxy have begun to resurface as the seals that contained them are weakened or destroyed by the warp's corrupting influence. The Shadowkeepers have taken it upon themselves to address these new threats as well, expanding their mandate beyond the recovery of escaped Dark Cells prisoners to encompass the identification and containment of any entity or artifact that falls within the broad category of things that should not exist freely in the galaxy. This is a natural extension of their original mission, and it is one that the Captain General has apparently sanctioned, either explicitly or tacitly, through his continued support for their operations. And the result is that the Shadowkeepers have become something unique within the Imperium's military structure. They are not just guardians, they are not just hunters. They are a containment force, a specialized formation dedicated to identifying, capturing and neutralizing threats that are too dangerous to be dealt with through conventional military means. They are the Imperium's answer to the question of what to do when the enemy is not an army to be defeated, but an entity to be imprisoned. Not a territory to be conquered, but an artifact to be secured and sealed away from all contact. In a galaxy where the barriers between reality and the warp are thinner than they have been since the Horus Heresy, where ancient horrors are stirring in places that have been quiet for millennia, and where the institutions of the Imperium are stretched to their breaking point by threats on every front, the Shadowkeepers' role has never been more vital. They are the thin black line between the galaxy and annihilation, the silent guardians who stand between humanity and the consequences of its own forgotten past. And they stand there still, as they have always stood, in the dark, in the silence, alone with the things that must never see the light of distant stars. The Shadowkeepers' expanded role in the era Indomitus has brought them into contact with other Imperial factions in ways that were previously rare or non-existent. And these interactions reveal fascinating aspects of the Shadowkeepers' character and their place within the broader ecosystem of the Imperium's military and political structures. Consider, for instance, as the relationship between the Shadowkeepers and the Inquisition. The Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition dedicated to combating demonic threats, operates in a sphere that occasionally overlaps with the Shadowkeepers' mandate. Both organizations deal with existential threats. Both operate under extreme secrecy. Both possess knowledge that would drive ordinary citizens to madness if it were widely known. But the relationship between them is characterized more by mutual wariness than by cooperation. The Inquisition, for all its power, does not know the full extent of what the dark cells contain. Individual inquisitors may have caught glimpses or heard rumors, but the Shadowkeepers guard their secrets even from the most powerful institutions of the Imperium. An inquisitor who stumbled too close to the truth about the dark cells would find themselves facing not an invitation to cooperation, but a wall of silence so absolute that even their formidable authority would be insufficient to breach it. The Custodians answer to the Emperor alone, and the Shadowkeepers take this principle to its logical extreme. No one outside their ranks is permitted to know what they guard, and they will take whatever measures are necessary to maintain that secrecy. The relationship with the Adeptus Mechanicus is more nuanced and more fraught with tension. The Mechanicus provides essential technical support for the dark cells, maintaining the ancient systems that power the containment fields and monitoring the technological components of the prison's infrastructure. The Door of Cogs, at the entrance reserved for Mechanicus personnel, is a permanent fixture of the dark cell's architecture, a physical reminder that even the Shadowkeepers cannot maintain their vigil entirely alone. But the Mechanicus approaches the dark cells with a hunger that the Shadowkeepers find deeply uncomfortable. To the tech priests, the cells represent one of the greatest concentrations of ancient technology in the galaxy, a treasure trove of knowledge from the dark age of technology that could revolutionize the Imperium's understanding of science and engineering. The idea that such wonders are locked away in the dark, studied by no one, used by no one, is almost physically painful to adherents of the Omnissiah. The temptation to examine, to reverse engineer, is to learn from the artifacts in the cells, is a constant pressure that the Shadowkeepers must manage with the same vigilance they apply to the cell's actual inmates. This tension has reportedly led to incidents over the millennia, cases where individual tech priests, or even entire Magos lineages, have attempted to access restricted portions of the cells or extract information about their contents through means both official and otherwise. The Shadowkeepers' response to such attempts has been, characteristically, swift and thorough. The secrecy of the dark cells is not negotiable, and those who attempt to penetrate it discover, usually too late, that the Shadowkeepers' commitment to their mandate extends to policing their own support staff with the same ruthless efficiency they apply to everything else. The Space Marines, for their part, regard the Shadowkeepers with a complex mixture of awe, respect, and discomfort. The Astartes are warriors born, creatures of action and aggression who define themselves through combat and the brotherhood of battle. The Shadowkeepers represent something alien to this ethos, warriors who have chosen stillness over action, patience over aggression, secrecy over glory. A Space Marine meeting a Shadowkeeper for the first time might feel something akin to what a wolf feels when it encounters a bear, an acknowledgement of a kindred predator, combined with an instinctive recognition that this is a creature that operates according to different rules. When Shadowkeepers deploy alongside Space Marines on reclamation missions, the dynamic is typically one of unquestioning deference from the Astartes. The Custodes outrank every Space Marine in the Imperial hierarchy, and the Shadowkeepers' specific knowledge about the threats they face makes their tactical authority absolute. Space Marines assigned to support Shadowkeeper operations find themselves operating under conditions of secrecy and information restriction that would be unfamiliar and potentially frustrating to warriors accustomed to comprehensive pre-battle briefings and clear strategic objectives. The Shadowkeepers do not explain their missions. They do not share the intelligence that drives their operations. They issue orders, and they expect those orders to be followed without question and without explanation. For Space Marines accustomed to the collaborative, brotherhood-driven command structures of their chapters, this can be a jarring experience. But the results speak for themselves. Shadowkeeper-led operations have an exceptionally high success rate, and the Marines who have served alongside them typically come away with a profound respect for the black-armored Custodians' competence and commitment, even if they remain entirely ignorant of the true purpose of the missions they participated in. We have spoken at length about the entities and artifacts that the dark cells contain, but there is one prisoner who deserves a section all his own, because his story intersects with the Shadowkeepers in ways that are deeply revealing about the nature of their duty and the limits of even the most perfect prison. We need to talk about Cypher. Cypher, the Lord of the Fallen. A figure so shrouded in mystery and contradiction that even his name is suspected to be a cipher, a code, a deliberate obfuscation designed to hide whatever truth lies beneath the cloak and the power armor. For 10,000 years, Cypher has haunted the galaxy, appearing and disappearing at seemingly random intervals, leaving chaos and confusion in his wake. He is hunted by the Dark Angels with a fervor that borders on obsession, because he is one of the Fallen, those Dark Angels who turned traitor during the destruction of Caliban at the end of the Horus Heresy and were scattered through time and space by the warp. But Cypher is not like the other Fallen. He is something more, something stranger, something that defies the neat categories of loyalist and traitor that define the Imperium's understanding of the heresy. He has saved Imperial forces as often as he has opposed them. He carries a sword that he has never been seen to draw, a weapon rumored to be the Lion Sword, the ancient blade of the Dark Angel's own Primarch, and he seems to be moving, slowly but inexorably, toward Terra, toward the Imperial Palace, toward some destination or purpose that no one outside his own enigmatic mind can fathom. Cypher's path eventually brought him to Terra itself. After helping the reborn Primarch Roboute Guilliman escape from captivity aboard a Red Corsair's Blackstone fortress, Cypher and a band of his fallen allies accompanied the Primarch on his journey back to the throne world. They fought alongside Guilliman during the battle against Magnus the Red on Luna, proving their worth as warriors, even as questions about their loyalty remained unanswered. But when they arrived on Terra, the welcome was not warm. Guilliman made no objection as the Adeptus Custodes arrested Cypher and his fallen companions and consigned them to the Dark Cells, the most secure prison in the Imperium, a prison from which, in thousands of years of operation, not a single inmate had ever escaped. Think about what this means for the Shadowkeepers. They were suddenly responsible for guarding not just the ancient horrors of old night, but also a space marine of unknown allegiance, unknown capabilities, and unknown purpose. A being who had already demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to evade capture and escape confinement. Cypher had eluded the Dark Angels for 10,000 years. He had slipped through the fingers of Inquisitors, Space Marine chapter masters, and even the forces of chaos. And now he was in the Shadowkeepers' care. Cypher, characteristically, he seemed unperturbed by his imprisonment. According to the novel that bears his name, he was confident that he would escape from a prison that no one had ever escaped from before. And he was right. When the Great Rift tore open across the galaxy, sending shock waves of warp energy cascading through the material universe, the effects reached even into the sealed depths of the Dark Cells. The wards trembled. The rune locks flickered, and in the confusion, amid the chaos of the Battle of Lion's Gate and the demonic assault on the Imperial Palace, Cypher and his Fallen made their break. The details of the escape are told in John French's novel from Cypher's own, deliberately unreliable perspective. The narrative is twisted and layered, full of deliberate ambiguities and possible falsehoods, because that is who Cypher is, a trickster, a manipulator, a being whose every word and action serves purposes that are visible only to himself. But what we can piece together from the story is deeply relevant to our understanding of the Shadowkeepers. The escape was not a brute force breakout. Cypher did not overpower his guards or blast through the walls of his cell. Instead, he exploited the chaos surrounding the Great Rift's opening, taking advantage of the disruption to the cell's systems and the thinning of the Shadowkeepers' ranks, as many were drawn away to fight in the Battle of Lion's Gate. He moved through the Dark Cells and into the Imperial Palace proper, with an almost preternatural awareness of the facility's layout and security systems, as if he had been studying them from inside his cell, and cataloguing weaknesses and preparing contingencies for the moment when the opportunity to escape presented itself. What is particularly unnerving about Cypher's escape is that it was not, apparently, the work of a single individual acting alone. The timing of the escape, coinciding precisely with the most catastrophic event to strike Terra since the Horus Heresy, suggests either extraordinary luck or some form of coordination with external forces. And the fact that several other cells were found empty at the same time, their inmates vanished without a trace, raises the deeply disturbing possibility that the breakout was part of a larger event, a coordinated exploitation of the Great Rift's effects by multiple entities that should not have been able to coordinate at all. For the Shadowkeepers, or Cypher's escape was a failure that struck at the very heart of their identity. They were the wardens of the most secure prison in the Imperium, and a prisoner had walked out on their watch. The fact that the escape occurred under extraordinary circumstances, during a crisis that exceeded anything the Shadowkeepers had faced in 10 millennia, offered little comfort. The cells had been breached, prisoners had escaped, and the most infamous of those prisoners was now loose in the Imperial Palace itself, pursued by Shadowkeepers, Dark Angels, and Imperial assassins through the labyrinthine corridors of the most sacred building in the Imperium. The hunt for Cypher within the palace is a story in its own right, full of twists and reversals, and the kind of layered narrative complexity that makes Warhammer 40,000 lore so compelling. But for our purposes, the key takeaway is what it reveals about the Shadowkeepers. They did not panic. They did not abandon their other duties to focus solely on Cypher. They maintained their vigil over the remaining cells, even as they dispatched forces to track the escaped prisoners, demonstrating the kind of disciplined, multi-front operational capability that their millennia of service had honed. A combined Adeptus Custodes and Sisters of Silence force under a shield captain named Dareth was assigned to pursue Cypher, while other Shadowkeeper elements continued to assess the damage to the dark cells and secure any inmates that might be on the verge of escaping. Whereas the fact that the Shadowkeepers could maintain this kind of operational tempo during the most chaotic period in Terra's recent history speaks volumes about their capabilities and their mental resilience. Ultimately, Cypher escaped from the Imperial Palace entirely, vanishing into the galaxy once more. For the Shadowkeepers, his escape remains an open wound, a reminder that even the most perfect prison is only as strong as the circumstances that sustain it. But it is also a lesson, one that has informed their approach to containment and security in the years since. The dark cells have been reinforced, new protocols have been implemented, and the Shadowkeepers stand watch with a heightened awareness born of hard experience, knowing that the price of complacency is too terrible to contemplate. Let us take a step back now and consider the Shadowkeepers in comparison to the other shield hosts of the Adeptus Custodes, because this comparison illuminates aspects of their character and their role that might otherwise go unnoticed. The Custodes maintain several major shield hosts, each dedicated to a specific aspect of the Emperor's defense. We have already mentioned some of them in passing, but it is worth examining them more closely because the contrast between the shield hosts reveal the breadth and depth of the Custodes' mission. The Dread Host, the instruments of the Emperor's wrath, are the Custodes' offensive arm. When the Emperor's enemies are identified, when a threat is judged to be severe enough to warrant the personal attention of the 10,000, it is the Dread Host that is unleashed. They are a breathtaking concentration of military might, hundreds of Custodians organized into multiple shield companies and transported aboard 3 ancient warships known as the Moiraids. The Dread Host has smashed greenskin warhordes, obliterated rebellious star systems, and crushed traitor crusades. Their very name is designed to inspire terror, and the devastation they leave in their wake has dissuaded hundreds of potential threats before they could even begin. The Solar Watch maintains a vigilant patrol over the approaches to the Sol system, guarding the routes by which enemy forces might reach Terra. They are speed and mobility personified, always moving, always watching, a tireless sentinel force that sweeps the void around humanity's cradle with the fierce protectiveness of wolves guarding their den. The Aquiline shield deploys to protect individuals who have been identified through means known only to the Custodians as essential to the Emperor's safety. They appear without warning at the side of generals, politicians, scholars, or other individuals whose survival serves the Emperor's inscrutable purposes. They do not explain why they have come. They do not negotiate the terms of their protection. They simply arrive, fight, and leave when their mission is complete, often without their charges ever understanding why they were selected for such extraordinary protection. The emissaries imperatus serve as the Emperor's heralds and diplomats, carrying his authority to the farthest corners of the galaxy. They are the voice of the Golden Throne, and their word carries a weight that even the most powerful imperial officials cannot ignore. When an emissary imperatus speaks, they speak with the Emperor's authority, and woe betide any who question their mandate. And then there are the Shadowkeepers. The contrast is striking. Where the Dread Host is aggression, the Shadowkeepers are patience. Where the Solar Watch is movement, the Shadowkeepers are stillness. Where the Aquiline shield protects individuals, the Shadowkeepers protect a concept, the concept of containment, the idea that some things must never be allowed to walk free in the galaxy. Where the emissaries imperatus represent the Emperor's voice, the Shadowkeepers represent his silence, the things he chose not to speak of, the secrets he judged too dangerous to share. Every shield host reflects a different aspect of the Emperor's vision for the defense of humanity. The Dread Host reflects his wrath. The Solar Watch reflects his vigilance. The Aquiline shield reflects his foresight. The emissaries imperatus reflect his authority. The Shadowkeepers reflect his caution, his awareness that some of the greatest threats to humanity come not from without, but from within, from the species' own past, from the creations of an age when human ambition outstripped human wisdom. The Shadowkeepers are the Emperor's acknowledgement that he, too, makes mistakes, or at least that the civilization he inherited was capable of making mistakes so catastrophic that 10,000 years of effort has not been enough to fully clean up the mess. This makes the Shadowkeepers, in a sense, the most humble of the shield hosts. Not humble in the way that they carry themselves, because they are still custodians, as still beings of superhuman pride and absolute confidence in their capabilities, but humble in the sense that their very existence is an admission of fallibility. Somebody created the things in the dark cells, somebody allowed them to exist, and somebody had to step forward and say, these things are too dangerous to be allowed to roam free, and I will be the one to ensure they never do. That somebody was the Emperor. And the Shadowkeepers are the living expression of his judgment. There is another aspect of the Custodes organization that connects to the Shadowkeepers in interesting ways, and that is the institution known as the Eyes of the Emperor. This is a sect of retired custodians, warriors who have suffered some diminishment in their capabilities, whether through age, injury, or simple attrition, and who have chosen to leave the direct service of the Golden Throne rather than continue in a diminished capacity. But the Eyes of the Emperor do not truly retire. They scatter across the galaxy, embedding themselves in the broader civilization of the Imperium, watching and listening and reporting back to the Custodes through channels that are known only to the Captain General and his most trusted advisors. They are the Custodes' intelligence network, a web of extremely capable operatives spread across 1 million worlds, each one a former member of the most elite military force in human history. The connection between the Eyes of the Emperor and the Shadowkeepers is not explicitly detailed in the lore, but the implications are fascinating. The Eyes see things. They gather information about threats across the galaxy, of threats that might include escaped Dark Cells prisoners, resurfacing Dark Age technology, or newly awakened entities that bear the hallmarks of Old Knight's legacy. It is reasonable to assume that at least some of the intelligence that drives the Shadowkeepers' reclamation missions comes from the Eyes of the Emperor, funneled through the Captain General's office and passed to the Lock Warden for action. This would make the Eyes of the Emperor the Shadowkeepers' eyes and ears in the wider galaxy, a vast reconnaissance network that compensates for the Shadowkeepers' relatively small numbers and their historical focus on terror. With the eyes feeding them intelligence, the Shadowkeepers can identify and respond to threats across the galaxy without having to maintain a large, visible presence in every sector. As it also raises the intriguing possibility that some Eyes of the Emperor are themselves former Shadowkeepers, veterans of the Dark Cells who have carried their forbidden knowledge out into the galaxy and who now watch for signs of the horrors they once guarded. A former Shadowkeeper embedded in the civilian population of a distant hive world would be uniquely qualified to recognize the signs of Dark Age technology resurfacing or of an escaped entity beginning to exert its influence on the surrounding population. They would know what to look for, what to fear, and how to alert the proper authorities without compromising the secrecy that the Shadowkeepers depend upon. This is, admittedly, speculative. The lore does not explicitly confirm this connection, but it is consistent with the way the Custodians operate, and it provides a plausible explanation for how the Shadowkeepers, with their limited numbers and their vast mandate, managed to maintain their awareness of threats across a galaxy that spans 100,000 light-years. Let us now turn to what we might call the atmosphere of the Shadowkeepers, the feeling that they evoke, not just in the lore, but in the broader culture of the Warhammer 40,000 fandom. Because there is something about the Shadowkeepers that resonates with people in a way that goes beyond the usual fascination with powerful warriors and dramatic battles. Part of it is the mystery. The Shadowkeepers are defined as much by what we do not know about them as by what we do. The contents of the Dark Cells are deliberately vague. The details of the Shadowkeepers' operations are suppressed, while the nature of the entities they guard is hinted at, but never fully described. This ambiguity creates a space in which the imagination can work, filling in the gaps with horrors that are all the more effective for being personal and subjective. Everyone who reads about the Shadowkeepers imagines the Dark Cells slightly differently. For some, the cells contain cosmic entities, beings of such vast and alien intelligence that the very act of perceiving them would shatter a human mind. For others, the cells hold weapons of unimaginable destructive power, devices that could unmake stars or rewrite the laws of physics. For still others, the cells contain something more subtle and more insidious, ideas and technologies that could corrupt or transform humanity in ways that would make the species unrecognizable. As all of these interpretations are valid, because the lore deliberately leaves room for all of them. The Shadowkeepers guard the unknown, and the unknown is by definition limitless in its potential for horror. This is masterful storytelling on Games Workshop's part, because it means that the Shadowkeepers can never be fully demystified, never be reduced to a simple list of capabilities and assets. There will always be more to them than what is on the page, more to their duty than what is explicitly described, more to the horrors they guard than what is revealed to the reader. Part of the Shadowkeepers' appeal also comes from the archetype they embody, the guardian of the sealed door, the keeper of the forbidden knowledge, the watcher in the dark. These are figures that appear in mythologies across every human culture. They are the dragon sitting atop its hoard, the sentinel at the gates of the underworld, the wise old guardian who warns the hero not to open the forbidden chest. These archetypes resonate because they speak to a fundamental human anxiety, the fear that somewhere, behind some door we have not yet opened, there is something waiting that will change everything if it is ever set free. The Shadowkeepers take this archetype and render it in the unique idiom of Warhammer 40,000, a setting where the forbidden doors are real, the horrors behind them are concrete and specific, and the consequences of failure are not metaphorical but catastrophically literal. In the Warhammer universe, the Dragon's Hoard is a collection of Dark Age weapons that could annihilate star systems, whilst the Forbidden Chest contains an entity that has been plotting its escape for 10,000 years. And the Guardian at the gate is not a symbol or a metaphor, but a living, breathing, 7-foot-tall, transhuman warrior in black armor who has been standing in the same corridor since before you or your grandparents were born. This grounding of mythology in the concrete specifics of the setting is what makes the Shadowkeepers so compelling. They are not just a cool concept, they are a fully realized faction within a fully realized universe, with a history and a purpose and a set of challenges that are specific to their circumstances. They face problems that are unique to them, experience pressures that are unique to them, and make sacrifices that are unique to them. And in doing so, they illuminate aspects of the Warhammer 40,000 setting that no other faction can. The Imperium of Man, for all its vastness and its military might, is fundamentally a civilization in decline. It is a civilization that has lost more than it has gained, that has forgotten more than it remembers, that clings to the remnants of a past it no longer understands. The Dark Cells are the physical manifestation of this truth. They contain the achievements and the mistakes of an age that the Imperium can neither replicate nor escape, locked away in the dark because they are too dangerous to use and too valuable or too resilient to destroy. The Shadowkeepers are the guardians of this legacy, and their duty is, in a very real sense, the duty of the Imperium itself, to endure, to hold the line, to keep the darkness at bay, as not because victory is possible, but because the alternative is too terrible to contemplate. The Shadowkeepers do not expect to win. They do not hope for a future in which their duty is no longer necessary. They simply stand and watch and wait, because that is all that can be done and because someone must do it. This is the Shadowkeepers' gift to the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Not a new army to field on the tabletop, though they work beautifully in that context. Not a new villain to oppose, though the things they guard could serve that role admirably. But a new way of thinking about what it means to serve in the grim darkness of the far future. A reminder that the greatest battles are not always the loudest, that the most important victories are not always the most visible, and that sometimes the most heroic thing a warrior can do is stand still, stand silent, and stand firm against a darkness that no one else can see. Let us now delve deeper into the visual and symbolic identity of the Shadowkeepers, because in Warhammer 40,000, where the aesthetic presentation of a faction carries enormous thematic weight, the way the Shadowkeepers look tells us almost as much about who they are as what the lore says about them. The standard colors of the Adeptus Custodes are, famously, gold. Not just any gold, but a rich, luminous, auric brilliance that evokes the Emperor's own radiance, the light of Terra's master shining from the armor of his most faithful servants. Gold is the color of divinity in the imperial cult, the color of purity and power, and the indomitable will of the master of mankind. Wow, when a citizen of the Imperium sees a golden warrior striding through the corridors of power, they see the Emperor's own hand reaching into the material world, and they fall to their knees in awe and terror. The Shadowkeepers wear black. This is not a subtle difference. In the visual language of Warhammer 40,000, color choices are deliberate and meaningful. The Shadowkeepers' black armor is a statement, a visual declaration that these custodians are something apart from their golden brothers. They do not shine. They do not radiate. They absorb light, drawing it into the darkness of their plate, like the cells they guard draw in the horrors of old night. The black is offset by elements of crimson, rich red robes, and a single red shoulder pauldron that stand out against the sable armor like drops of blood on a darkened blade. But this combination, black and red, carries its own symbolic weight. Black for secrecy, for the void, for the absence of light and knowledge. Red for sacrifice, for the blood shed in silent service, for the vital warmth of human life maintained in the coldest and most inhospitable of environments. The Shadowkeeper's armor is also adorned with motifs of keys and locks, visual representations of their role as the keepers of sealed doors. These are not merely decorative elements. They are symbols of authority, marks of office that identify the wearer as one who holds power over the most dangerous secrets in the Imperium. A Shadowkeeper bearing the key motif carries with them the implicit authority to open or seal the cells, to release or contain the horrors within, and to make the terrible decisions that their duty demands. The overall effect is striking and unmistakable. Where a standard custodian is a figure of blazing glory, a golden angel of the Emperor's light, a Shadowkeeper is a figure of grim purpose, a dark sentinel who moves through the world like a living shadow. There is a menace to their appearance that goes beyond mere martial threat. A Shadowkeeper looks like what they are, a guardian of things that should not be seen, a keeper of secrets that should not be spoken, a warrior who has stared into the abyss so long that the abyss has become part of them. This visual identity translates beautifully to the tabletop, where Shadowkeeper armies present a striking contrast to standard Custodians forces. What the sea of gold that characterizes a typical Custodians army is replaced by ranks of black-armored warriors, whose dark plate and crimson accents create an atmosphere of brooding menace. On the table, a Shadowkeeper force looks like exactly what it is: an elite within an elite, a force apart even from the already legendary warriors of the 10,000. The painting and modeling community within the Warhammer hobby has embraced the Shadowkeepers with particular enthusiasm, and it is not hard to see why. The black and red color scheme is visually dramatic, offering hobbyists the opportunity to create striking models that stand out from the crowd. The key and lock motifs provide opportunities for detailed freehand work and customization. And the lore behind the Shadowkeepers provides a rich narrative foundation for building themed armies and creating compelling backstories for individual models. But beyond the purely aesthetic considerations, the Shadowkeepers' visual identity serves a narrative purpose that reinforces everything we have discussed about their character and their role. They look different because they are different. They dress in darkness because they dwell in darkness. They bear the symbols of locks and keys because they are the guardians of sealed doors. Every element of their visual presentation is a reflection of their duty, and every model painted in the Shadowkeepers' colors is a small testament to the story that Games Workshop has built around this fascinating and deeply compelling shield host. There is a question that often comes up in discussions of the Shadowkeepers among fans of the lore, and it is a question that I think deserves a thoughtful answer. The question is this: what would happen if the dark cells failed completely? What if the wards broke down, the seals shattered, and everything imprisoned beneath the Imperial Palace was released at once? The honest answer is that we do not know, because the lore has never described this scenario in detail. But we can make educated guesses, based on what we do know about the nature of the threats contained in the cells and the scale of the catastrophe that the Shadowkeepers are designed to prevent. The entities and artifacts in the dark cells are described as things that could annihilate the Imperium, not threaten it, not weaken it, annihilate it. This is the language used in the official sources, and it suggests a level of destructive potential that goes beyond anything we are accustomed to seeing in the Warhammer 40,000 setting, even in a setting where galaxy-spanning wars, demonic incursions, and planet-destroying weapons are commonplace. If the dark cells failed completely, the most likely immediate consequence would be a catastrophe centered on terror itself. The entities breaking free would emerge into the Imperial Palace, the most heavily defended location in the Imperium, but also the most symbolically and strategically important. The Golden Throne, the Astronomicon, the administrative heart of the Imperium, all of these would be directly threatened by whatever emerged from the cells. But the consequences would extend far beyond terror. The artifacts in the cells include weapons of Dark Age origin, devices capable of effects that the Imperium of the 41st Millennium cannot replicate or defend against. If these weapons fell into the wrong hands, or if they activated autonomously upon release, the resulting destruction could cascade across entire sectors, destabilizing an Imperium that is already teetering on the brink of collapse. And then there are the entities, living things, or things that approximate life, beings of power and intelligence and alien intent that have been nursing their grievances in the dark for 10,000 years. What would they do upon release? Some might seek revenge against their jailers. Others might pursue agendas that were interrupted by their imprisonment, agendas that could involve the manipulation or destruction of entire civilizations. As still others might simply be compelled by their nature to wreak havoc, beings of pure destruction that would tear through the material world like wildfire through dry grass. The collective release of all of these things simultaneously would be, to put it mildly, an extinction-level event. Not just for the Imperium, but potentially for the entire galaxy. The things in the dark cells were locked away because the Emperor judged them to be existential threats. And the Emperor's judgment, whatever else might be said about it, was not prone to exaggeration. This is what the Shadowkeepers prevent, every day, every hour, every moment of their endless vigil. They stand between the galaxy and its annihilation, and they do it without fanfare, without recognition, without any of the glory that attaches to the warriors who fight the Imperium's more visible wars. The next time you think about the Warhammer 40,000 setting and its endless parade of existential threats, from chaos incursions to tyrannid hive fleets to Necron dynasties, remember that beneath the Imperial Palace, there are things locked away that make all of those threats look manageable by comparison. And remember that the only reason those things remain locked away is because a few hundred warriors in black armor stand in the dark and refuse to let them out. That is the Shadowkeepers' contribution to the survival of humanity. It is not dramatic. It is not glorious. It does not make for stirring battle hymns or inspiring legends. But it is absolutely, fundamentally, irreplaceably necessary. Without the Shadowkeepers, there is no Imperium. Without the Shadowkeepers, there is no humanity. Without the Shadowkeepers, there is nothing. And they know it. They have always known it. And they stand their watch regardless, because that is who they are, and that is what they do. As we draw toward the end of our exploration, let us spend a moment considering the future of the Shadowkeepers. Because in the rapidly evolving narrative of Warhammer 40,000, where the setting is being advanced through new editions, new codexes, and new novels, at a pace that would have been unimaginable a decade ago, the Shadowkeepers are poised to play an increasingly prominent role. The Great Rift has changed the calculus of the Shadowkeepers' mission in ways that are still being explored. The escape of entities from the dark cells is not a problem that can be solved quickly or easily. These are beings and artifacts that survived the Age of Strife, that endured 10,000 years of imprisonment, and that possess capabilities that the Imperium can barely comprehend. Tracking them across a galaxy that has been torn in half by the Great Rift is a task that could take centuries, and there is no guarantee that every escapee will be recovered. Meanwhile, new threats continue to emerge. The weakening of the barriers between reality and the warp has stirred dormant horrors to wakefulness across the galaxy. Technologies that were sealed away in forgotten vaults are resurfacing. Entities that have been quiescent for millennia are beginning to move. The Shadowkeepers' mandate is expanding, not because they want it to, but because the galaxy is forcing their hand. There is also the question of what happens to the dark cells themselves. The technological infrastructure of the prison complex is ancient, and in many cases, irreplaceable. The damage inflicted during the Great Rift's opening may have compromised systems that cannot be fully repaired. The Shadowkeepers may find themselves engaged in an ongoing struggle to maintain the integrity of the cells, even as they pursue escaped prisoners across the galaxy, fighting on two fronts with resources that were barely adequate for one. And then there is the looming question of what the Emperor himself might want. Since the opening of the Great Rift, there have been hints in the lore that the Emperor's psychic might have become more active, more directed, more purposeful. If the Emperor is indeed exerting a more direct influence on galactic events, what might he want done with the dark cells and their contents? Would he order the Shadowkeepers to release certain entities or technologies to serve the Imperium's needs in its hour of greatest peril? Would he demand that the cells be reinforced at any cost, even at the expense of other military priorities? Or would he, as he has for 10 millennia, remain silent, leaving the Shadowkeepers to carry out their duty as they see fit, trusting in the judgment that he instilled in them at their creation. These are questions that future lore releases may answer. For now, they hang in the air like the whispered threats that echo through the corridors of the dark cells, unresolved and unresolvable, adding another layer of tension and uncertainty to the Shadowkeepers' already impossible burden. What is certain is that the Shadowkeepers will endure, or they have endured the Horus heresy. They have endured 10,000 years of silent vigil. They have endured the opening of the Great Rift and the breach of their cells. They will endure whatever comes next, because endurance is not merely what they do, it is what they are. The darkness will not break them. It never has, and as long as the Shadowkeepers stand their watch, it never will. Now let us talk about combat doctrine in greater detail. Because while the Shadowkeepers are defined primarily by their role as guardians and jailers, they are still custodians, still warriors of a caliber that surpasses anything else in the Imperium's arsenal. And when they fight in a manner that is uniquely their own, shaped by the demands of their duty and the nature of the enemies they are designed to confront. The first thing to understand about the Shadowkeepers' approach to combat is that it is, in many ways, an extension of their approach to containment. The same qualities that make them effective guardians, patience, precision, relentless focus, unyielding determination, also make them devastatingly effective in battle. But where other custodian formations might approach combat as an end in itself, seeking to destroy the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible, the Shadowkeepers often approach it as a means to an end, the end being the capture and containment of their target. This distinction is important because it shapes every aspect of how the Shadowkeepers fight. Consider a typical reclamation mission. The Shadowkeepers have identified the location of an escaped entity or a dangerous artifact. Their objective is not to destroy it, worse because many of the things they pursue cannot be destroyed, or because destroying them would release energies worse than the threat the entity itself poses. Their objective is to capture the target and return it to the dark cells, alive if it is a living thing, intact if it is an artifact, and contained within whatever specialized equipment is necessary to prevent it from causing further harm. This requires a very different set of tactical skills than a standard military engagement. The Shadowkeepers must be able to fight their way to the target, neutralizing any opposition that stands in their path, while simultaneously maintaining the discipline and control necessary to capture the target without damaging or destroying it. They must be able to operate in environments that may be saturated with hostile psychic energy, a warp-tainted corruption, or the reality-bending effects of Dark Age technology. And they must be able to do all of this while maintaining operational security, ensuring that no information about their mission or their target leaks to parties who are not authorized to know. This is combat as surgery, precise, controlled, and utterly purposeful. Every action the Shadowkeepers take in battle is in service of the objective, and the objective is always containment. They do not get distracted by secondary targets. They do not pursue fleeing enemies beyond the requirements of the mission. They do not engage in the kind of prolonged, grinding battles of attrition that characterize many of the Imperium's wars. They strike, they contain, and they withdraw, and leaving behind nothing but silence and the bodies of anyone foolish enough to have stood in their way. The Shadowkeepers' fighting style is described as that of the Wardens of the Dark Cells, a designation that translates into very specific tactical approaches. They are characterized by an unrelenting pursuit of their quarry, whether that quarry is a living entity, a beast of some kind, or a dark artifact that must be recovered and contained. When the Shadowkeepers identify their target, they lock onto it with a focus that borders on the obsessive, and they do not relent until the target has been apprehended or destroyed. This single-mindedness extends to their behavior in close combat. Enemies who engage the Shadowkeepers in melee find themselves facing warriors whose presence is not merely physically imposing, but psychically oppressive. Whilst the Shadowkeepers' long exposure to the horrors of the dark cells has imbued them with a quality that is difficult to describe, but unmistakable in its effect. They project an aura of dread, a psychic weight that bears down on their opponents and saps their will to fight. Enemies within close quarters of the Shadowkeepers find their combat effectiveness diminished, their attacks becoming fewer and less coordinated as the oppressive atmosphere that surrounds these black-armored warriors seeps into their minds and bodies. This is not a psychic attack in the conventional sense. The Custodians are not psykers, and they do not wield the warp as a weapon. Rather, it is a passive emanation, the natural consequence of spending centuries or millennia in proximity to the most dangerous psychic and metaphysical entities in the galaxy. The Shadowkeepers have absorbed something of the darkness they guard, and that darkness now follows them onto the battlefield, an invisible miasma that weakens and demoralizes any foe unfortunate enough to stand against them. Think about what it must be like to face a Shadowkeeper in battle. You see a figure in black armor advancing toward you, moving with the fluid, predatory grace of a being designed by the Emperor himself. The figure is enormous, towering over even the enhanced warriors of the Space Marines, clad in plate that has been wrought by the finest artisans of terror and blessed by 10,000 years of sacred tradition. In its hands, it carries a weapon of ancient and mysterious origin, a guardian spear or Castellan axe that has been bathed in the light of the Emperor's own forge and tempered in the darkness of the deepest cells beneath the palace. And as the figure draws closer, you feel something beyond the physical threat of its weapons and armor. You feel a weight pressing down on your thoughts, a coldness creeping into your bones, a gnawing doubt that erodes your confidence and your will to fight. You feel as if you are standing at the edge of a pit that has no bottom, staring into a darkness that is staring back at you with patient, hungry intelligence. Your hands shake, your aim falters, your combat drills, the reflexes that have been hammered into your muscle memory through years of training, suddenly seem uncertain and unreliable, and then the Shadowkeeper strikes, and you realize that the psychological pressure was the least of your problems. The weapons carried by the Shadowkeepers deserve special attention because they are not merely instruments of war, but symbols of the Shield host's unique identity and purpose. The leaders of the Shadowkeepers carry ancient weapons of mysterious provenance, weapons whose origins are shrouded in the same secrecy that surrounds the dark cells themselves. These weapons are not standard Custodian wargear. They are relics of an earlier age, tools specifically designed to combat the kinds of threats that the Shadowkeepers are tasked with containing. We have already discussed the auric shackles, the Dark Age fetters that shut down the neural networks of sentient beings and render even the thought of escape impossible. But the Shadowkeepers' arsenal extends beyond containment devices. They carry weapons that are optimized for fighting enemies that operate outside the normal parameters of physical reality. Enemies that may be partially or wholly immaterial. Enemies that may exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Enemies that may be resistant or immune to conventional weapons fire. The nature of these weapons is not described in detail in the lore, and this is deliberate. Like the contents of the dark cells themselves, the Shadowkeepers' specialized weapons are part of the mystery, part of the vast, deliberately unexplored territory that makes this shield host so fascinating. What we can infer is that these weapons are effective against threats that would be untouchable by standard military hardware, and that their use requires specialized training and knowledge that is restricted to the Shadowkeepers alone. On the tabletop, the Shadowkeepers have been represented across multiple editions of the game, with rules that reflect their lore-based characteristics. Their signature fighting style, Wardens of the Dark Cells, reduces the effectiveness of enemies who engage them in close combat, representing the oppressive psychic aura that the Shadowkeepers project. They have access to stratagems that allow them to force enemies to fight last, representing the paralyzing dread that their presence induces, and they carry relics that enhance their ability to hunt and suppress enemy characters, reflecting their role as specialists in the containment of powerful individual threats. Yet the Shadowkeepers' approach to ranged combat is somewhat different from their approach to melee. While they are perfectly capable of devastating an enemy at range, as all Custodians are, Their preferred method of engagement is to close to striking distance as quickly as possible. This is because their primary targets, the entities and artifacts they are tasked with containing, are often resistant to or unaffected by conventional ranged fire. The weapons and techniques that the Shadowkeepers employ most effectively are those that require physical proximity, tools of binding and containment that must be applied directly to the target. This preference for close-quarters engagement makes the Shadowkeepers natural aggressors in tabletop gameplay. Despite their defensive lore, they want to be in the thick of the fight, where their oppressive aura can erode enemy effectiveness and where their specialized weapons can be brought to bear against priority targets. A well-played Shadowkeeper force functions like a contracting net, closing in on the enemy from multiple angles and squeezing them into an ever tighter space where escape becomes impossible, exactly as a team of jailers might corner an escaped prisoner in the corridors of the dark cells. The contrast between the Shadowkeepers' battlefield behavior and that of other custodian formations is striking and deliberate. Where the dread host descends upon its enemies like a golden hammer, shattering formations and breaking armies through sheer, overwhelming force, the Shadowkeepers operate more like a net, enclosing their target area with patient precision and tightening their grip until nothing can escape. Where the Solar Watch prioritizes speed and mobility, patrolling the approaches to terror with the urgency of sentinels who must cover vast distances, the Shadowkeepers are methodical and thorough, leaving no corner unsearched and no possibility unconsidered. This is the fighting style of jailers, not soldiers. And in the Shadowkeepers' case, it is devastatingly effective. Because the things they hunt are not ordinary enemies. They are entities and artifacts of immense power that have survived for millennia precisely because they are difficult to contain. Overwhelming force is often counterproductive against such targets. What is needed is precision, patience, and an unshakable will that refuses to be deterred by the horrifying nature of the quarry. The Shadowkeepers possess all of these qualities in abundance. They have been training for this work for 10,000 years, even if they did not know it at the time. Every decade spent standing vigil in the dark cells was preparation for the moment when they would be called upon to hunt. Every encounter with the psychic emanations of imprisoned horrors was training for the moment when they would face those horrors in the open, without the protection of sealed cells and rune-locked doors. And so, the Shadowkeepers hunt. Across a galaxy torn in half by the Great Rift, through war zones and wastelands and the ruins of worlds that have fallen to the darkness they swore to contain. Again, the black-armored Custodians pursue their quarry with the same implacable determination that has defined their shield host since its founding. They will not rest until every escapee has been recaptured, every lost artifact recovered, and every cell in the dark cells is once again sealed and secure. It is a task that may take centuries. It is a task that may never be fully completed, given the chaos and upheaval that now grips the galaxy. But the Shadowkeepers have never been deterred by the magnitude of their duty. They have stood watch over horrors that could end the galaxy for 10,000 years. They will stand watch for 10,000 more if that is what is required. Because that is what the Shadowkeepers do. They endure, they persist, and they never, ever let go. There is something profoundly compelling about the philosophical dimensions of the Shadowkeepers' existence, something that goes beyond the immediate drama of their lore and touches on deeper questions about the nature of duty, sacrifice, knowledge, and the cost of protecting others from truths they cannot bear. Let us take a moment here to simply imagine what the daily existence of a Shadowkeeper is like. Not in the abstract, not in terms of lore entries and codex descriptions, but in the lived, moment-to-moment experience of a being who has chosen, or been chosen, to spend their life standing guard over the unimaginable. Picture a corridor. It is not wide, perhaps 10 meters across, but it stretches forward into a darkness that seems to have weight, that seems to press against the lumen strips that provide the only illumination. Up the walls are smooth, polished to a mirror finish, but darkened by centuries of accumulated atmosphere, so that they reflect nothing clearly, but instead return a dim, distorted version of whatever stands before them. The floor is adamantium, cold even through the soles of custodian boots, and it echoes with every footfall in a way that makes the silence between steps feel louder than the steps themselves. There are doors set into the walls at irregular intervals. They are not ordinary doors. They are barriers of layered alloy and arcane material, sealed with rune locks whose patterns glow faintly in the gloom, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm that might be mistaken for a heartbeat if you did not know better. Behind each door, contained within a cell designed by the Emperor himself, something waits. Something that is aware of you even though you cannot see it. Something that knows you are there, standing in the corridor, walking your patrol route for the 10,000th time, and that watches you with senses that do not require eyes. You do not speak. There is no one to speak to, not here, not on this level. Your brothers are on other levels, other corridors, each one walking their own route in their own silence. You communicate through the Vox network that connects all Shadowkeepers in the facility, but the network is used sparingly, only for essential information, never for conversation. The silence is part of the duty. It is a discipline in itself, a way of maintaining the mental stillness that the vigil requires. You walk, one foot in front of the other, each step measured and deliberate. Your senses are enhanced far beyond the capabilities of any baseline human, are attuned to every detail of your environment. The temperature of the air, the faint vibrations that travel through the floor from the power systems deep below, the almost imperceptible fluctuations in the rune lock's glow that might indicate a change in the condition of the inmate behind the door. You notice everything, catalogue everything, assess everything against the baseline of normal that you have established over decades of observation. And sometimes you feel something else, a pressure against the edges of your consciousness, subtle and insidious, like fingers testing the weave of a fabric for weak spots. It is one of them, reaching out from behind its door, probing your mental defenses with the lazy, impatient malice of a predator that has been caged for millennia and has nothing to do but look for weaknesses in the walls. You do not respond. You do not acknowledge the contact. You simply continue walking, maintaining the same pace, the same vigilance, the same absolute control over your mind and your body that you have maintained for longer than many civilizations have existed. The pressure fades. It always fades, eventually. The entities in the cells are patient, but they are not infinitely so. They probe, they test, they withdraw, and they wait for the next opportunity. And you endure, because that is what you were made for, because that is what the Emperor requires of you, and because you know, with a certainty that goes beyond belief and into the realm of knowledge, that the moment you falter, even for an instant, the consequences will be beyond calculation. This is the daily life of a Shadowkeeper, not battles and glory and the clash of armies on distant worlds. Standing in a corridor, walking a patrol route, enduring the psychic pressure of entities that have been trying to break free for 10,000 years, and doing it again and again and again, day after day, year after year, century after century, with the same unwavering dedication that they brought to their first day of service. It is, in its way, one of the most heroic things in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Not because it is dramatic, not because it is exciting, but because it is hard, because it requires a kind of courage that is fundamentally different from the courage of the battlefield, a courage that is measured not in seconds of desperate action, but in decades of quiet, in a grinding endurance, the courage to stand still when every instinct screams for movement, the courage to be patient when the darkness presses in from all sides, the courage to endure when there is no end in sight and no reward on the horizon. This is the courage of the Shadowkeepers, and it is a courage that deserves to be recognized, even if the Shadowkeepers themselves would never ask for such recognition. Consider the paradox at the heart of the Shadowkeepers' identity. They are among the most knowledgeable beings in the Imperium. They know things that even the Captain General may not fully comprehend. They understand the true scope of the threats that exist in the galaxy, the remnants of an age when humanity wielded power comparable to that of the gods and nearly destroyed itself in the process. They know what lurks in the darkness, or not as abstract concepts or theoretical possibilities, but as concrete, tangible realities that they have stood beside for centuries. And yet this knowledge, far from empowering them, isolates them. It sets them apart from their brothers, from the wider Imperium, from any being that has not shared their experience. The Shadowkeepers cannot speak of what they know. They cannot share the burden of their awareness. They bear it alone, in the dark, and the weight of it shapes them in ways that are subtle but profound. There is a loneliness to the Shadowkeepers that is unique within the Custodians. The other shield hosts operate in the broader context of the Imperium's military and political apparatus. The Dread Host strikes at enemies on distant worlds. The Solar Watch patrols the approaches to Terra, where the Aquilan Shield interacts with the individuals it protects. Even the Companions, standing their silent vigil around the Golden Throne, do so in the presence of their master, sustained by the knowledge that the Emperor's psychic might fills the chamber in which they stand. The Shadowkeepers stand alone with the opposite of the Emperor's light. They stand in the dark, surrounded by the psychic emanations of things that hate them and everything they represent. Their companions are not their brothers, but their prisoners, beings of such alien malevolence that even the act of perceiving their awareness can erode the edges of a custodian's formidable mental defenses. And yet, they do not falter. They do not break. They stand their watch, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, as maintaining their vigil with a devotion that transcends mere duty and enters the realm of something approaching sacred purpose. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Shadowkeepers. Not their martial prowess, which is extraordinary, not their secrecy, which is unparalleled, not even the nature of the horrors they guard, which is terrifying beyond description. The most remarkable thing about the Shadowkeepers is their endurance, their sheer, stubborn, unyielding refusal to let the darkness break them. In a setting where corruption is ever present, where the strongest wills can be subverted and the purest souls can be tainted, the Shadowkeepers stand as proof that there are some walls that the darkness cannot breach. Not because those walls are impervious, but because the warriors who man them choose every day to hold firm, to endure, to remain true to their duty despite the cost, despite the isolation and the silence and the crushing, endless weight of knowledge that they carry alone. This is, in its way, one of the most hopeful messages in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. Not hope in the grand sense, not the hope of ultimate victory or the triumph of good over evil. Something smaller and more personal. The hope that even in the darkest circumstances, even in the face of horrors beyond description, the human spirit, or in this case, the transhuman spirit, can endure, can hold the line, can refuse to break. The Shadowkeepers are not celebrated. They are not thanked. They are not even known to exist by the vast majority of the Imperium's citizens. They serve without expectation of recognition, without hope of reward, or without any of the usual incentives that motivate warriors to feats of courage and endurance. They serve because their duty demands it, because the alternative is unthinkable, and because they are the only beings in the galaxy capable of doing what must be done. And in the end, that is enough. It has to be enough, because there is no one else. There is only the Shadowkeepers, the Dark Cells, and the endless, silent war waged in the deepest places of the Emperor's domain. There is one more dimension to the Shadowkeepers' story that we should explore before we conclude, and it is perhaps the most unsettling dimension of all. Because the Dark Cells are not merely a prison, they are a testament to a truth that the Imperium would rather forget. The truth that humanity, at the height of its power, created things that should never have existed. Yes, that the species which now clings to survival in a hostile galaxy, sustained by ignorance and faith in the psychic might of a dying god, once reached heights of knowledge and capability so vast that the remnants of that achievement must be locked away in the deepest holes available, guarded by the most elite warriors in existence, for fear that even the memory of what was accomplished could lead to catastrophe. The dark cells are a mirror held up to humanity's past, and the reflection is terrifying. They remind us that the galaxy was not always as it is now, that there was a time when humanity did not merely survive, but thrived, when it commanded technologies that made the mightiest weapons of the 41st millennium look like crude toys by comparison. And they remind us that all of that power, all of that achievement, or all of that staggering capability led ultimately to ruin, to the age of strife, to old night, to the desperate, fragmented, benighted civilization that the Emperor found when he emerged from the shadows to begin his work of unification. The Shadowkeepers guard the evidence of this failure, and in doing so, they serve as a living warning against the hubris that caused it. They remind us, silently and without fanfare, that there are things humanity was not meant to know, powers it was not meant to wield, and creations it was not meant to make. The dark cells exist because humanity once overreached, and the consequences of that overreach are still being felt 10,000 years later. This is the final, deepest layer of the Shadowkeepers' duty. They do not merely guard prisoners and artifacts, they guard a truth. But the truth that humanity's greatest enemy has always been itself, its own ambition, its own insatiable hunger for knowledge and power. The things in the dark cells are not alien invaders or demonic entities, though some may resemble both. They are humanity's own creations, the children of an age when the species had the power to build anything it could imagine, and the arrogance to imagine things that should never have been built. And the Shadowkeepers stand between those creations and the rest of humanity, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are never repeated, ensuring that the darkness stays where it belongs, in the cells, in the silence, in the deep places beneath the Imperial Palace, where the golden light of the Emperor does not reach. There is a question that haunts the edges of the Shadowkeepers' existence, and a question that no amount of duty or discipline can fully silence. It is the question of whether what they do is enough, whether standing guard over the remnants of old night, containing them in cells that grow older and more fragile with each passing century, is a sustainable solution to the problem they represent. The things in the dark cells are not going away. They are not diminishing. If anything, they are growing more dangerous, more restless, more capable of exploiting the weaknesses in their containment. The Great Rift's opening proved that the cells can be breached. The escapes that occurred proved that the inmates can be freed. What happens when the next crisis comes? What happens when the wards fail again? Also, when the Shadowkeepers' numbers are depleted beyond the point where they can maintain effective coverage of 81 levels of cells? What happens when the technology that keeps the prison functioning finally degrades beyond the ability of anyone, custodian or mechanicus, to repair? These are questions without answers, at least for now. The Shadowkeepers cannot destroy what they guard, because many of the things in the cells cannot be destroyed, or because their destruction would cause consequences worse than their continued imprisonment. They cannot seek outside help, because the knowledge of what they guard is itself a danger that must be contained. They cannot simply walk away, because the things in the cells will not obligingly stay put if their guards abandon their posts. All the Shadowkeepers can do is what they have always done: stand their watch, maintain their vigil, endure the darkness, day after day, century after century, and hope that their endurance is enough. It is a bleak calculus, and it is one of the things that makes the Shadowkeepers so compelling as a fictional creation. They are not characters who are building toward a triumphant conclusion. They are not warriors on a quest that will eventually be completed. They are beings engaged in an eternal holding action, a never-ending battle against entropy and malice that can never be won, only maintained. Their victory is not the defeat of their enemies, but the simple, profound act of continuing to exist, of continuing to stand, of continuing to hold the line against a darkness that will never stop pressing against their defenses. In this, here the Shadowkeepers are perhaps the most honest representation of the Warhammer 40,000 setting's central theme. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Not war that leads to victory or peace. War that is its own perpetual condition, a state of being that has no beginning and no end. The Shadowkeepers embody this truth more completely than any other faction in the setting, because their war is not interrupted by moments of triumph or respite. It is constant, unyielding, and eternal. And yet, within that bleakness, there is something that might be called beauty. The beauty of dedication, the beauty of sacrifice, the beauty of beings who stand against impossible odds, not because they expect to win, but because standing is the right thing to do. The Shadowkeepers may never know peace, they may never know rest, they may never know the satisfaction of a duty completed and a burden lifted, but they know purpose. They know the absolute certainty that what they do matters, that their vigil has meaning, that their sacrifice serves a goal greater than themselves. And in a galaxy that is often defined by its meaninglessness, by the random cruelty of a universe that does not care whether humanity survives or perishes, that certainty of purpose is itself a kind of salvation. Let us bring our exploration to its conclusion by reflecting on what the Shadowkeepers mean for us, the fans and enthusiasts who engage with the Warhammer 40,000, setting not just as consumers of entertainment, but as participants in one of the richest and most complex fictional universes ever created. As the Shadowkeepers offer us something that is increasingly rare in the landscape of science fiction and fantasy. They offer us a story about the value of unglamorous work, about the importance of the things that happen behind the scenes, out of sight, away from the spotlight, about the warriors who fight not for glory or recognition, but simply because the fight needs to be fought, and they are the only ones capable of fighting it. In a media landscape that is often dominated by stories of chosen ones and dramatic last stands and heroic sacrifices that are witnessed and celebrated by all, the Shadowkeepers remind us that some of the most important work in any endeavor is done by people who will never be recognized for it. The night watchman who keeps vigil while others sleep. The maintenance worker who ensures that critical systems continue to function. The administrator who catches the error that would have cascaded into catastrophe. These are not the characters who typically get their own movies or their own novels, but they are the characters without whom the heroes' stories could never happen. The Shadowkeepers are the Warhammer 40,000 settings tribute to these unsung heroes, rendered in the exaggerated, operatic idiom that makes the setting so uniquely compelling. They take the quiet courage of the everyday guardian and scale it up to cosmic proportions, transforming it into something epic and awe-inspiring without losing the essential humanity, the essential relatability of the original concept. When you look at a Shadowkeeper, whether in the art, on the tabletop, or in the pages of the lore, you are looking at a being who has dedicated their existence to a task that will never be finished, a purpose that will never be fully achieved, and you are looking at a being who has made peace with that fact, who has found meaning not in the completion of their duty, but in its continuation, not in the destination, but in the journey. That is a powerful message. It is a message that resonates beyond the fictional universe of Warhammer 40,000 and speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. We all face, at one time or another, the realization that some of the things we care about most will never be fully accomplished, that the work we do is part of a larger ongoing effort that extends beyond our individual lifetimes, that our contribution, no matter how significant, is just one thread in a larger weave that will continue long after we are gone. The Shadowkeepers show us how to respond to that realization, not with despair, not with resignation, but with quiet, unyielding determination, with the commitment to do the work that needs to be done, for as long as it needs to be done, without expectation of reward or recognition. with the understanding that the value of the work lies not in its completion, but in its doing. This is the story of the Shadowkeepers, the wardens of the dark cells, the most secret custodians in the Imperium of man, warriors who fight not with bolter and blade, but with patience and will, who wage their war not on battlefields, but in corridors that have never seen the sun, who guard not borders or positions, but secrets, terrible and ancient and absolutely necessary. They are the lock on the door that must never be opened. They are the keepers of the shadows that must never see the light. And as long as they stand, as long as they endure, as long as they refuse to let the darkness break them, there is hope, not much, not enough, but something. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the Shadowkeepers offer something that no other force in the Imperium can provide. Not victory, not glory, not salvation. Something simpler, something rarer. They offer certainty. The certainty that somewhere, in the deepest dark, someone is standing watch. Someone is holding the line. Someone is keeping the nightmares where they belong. And that certainty, fragile and hard-won though it may be, and is the closest thing to comfort that the 41st Millennium has to offer. The cells hold, the wards endure, the Shadowkeepers stand, and somewhere, in the darkness beneath the golden halls of the Imperial Palace, a custodian in black armor walks a corridor that no one else will ever see, standing guard over things that no one else will ever know about, bearing a burden that no one else could carry. They do not complain, they do not falter, they do not break. They simply endure, and the galaxy goes on. We have come a long way together tonight, you and I. We have descended into the deepest reaches of the Imperial Palace, to places that no ordinary citizen of the Imperium will ever see, that most citizens of the Imperium will never even know exist. We have walked the corridors of the dark cells, and felt the psychic pressure of entities that have been imprisoned since before the Imperium was born, and heard the stories of the warriors who stand between those entities and the rest of humanity. We have met the Shadowkeepers. We have learned their history, their methods, their burdens, and their sacrifices. We have explored the nature of the threats they guard against, from the nightmares of old night to the escaped horrors of the Great Rift. We have considered their relationships with other Imperial factions, their combat doctrine, their visual identity, and the philosophical dimensions of their existence. And through it all, one truth has remained constant. The Shadowkeepers are, in many ways, the most extraordinary warriors in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting, not because they are the strongest, though they are immensely powerful, not because they are the most skilled, though their abilities are without peer, but because they have chosen the hardest path available to a warrior, the path of silence, the path of darkness, the path of endurance without end, sacrifice without recognition, and duty without the comfort of knowing that the work will ever be done. Every great fictional universe needs its guardians of last resort, its hidden protectors who stand between civilization and the abyss. In Warhammer 40,000, a setting that is uniquely rich in existential threats and cosmic horrors, the Shadowkeepers fill that role with a gravitas and a depth that elevates them beyond mere military units and into the realm of something approaching myth. They are the lock on the door, the weight on the lid, the hand that holds back the flood, and they ask nothing in return, but no glory, no fame, no statues in their honor or songs in their name, just the continuation of their duty, the preservation of their vigil, and the knowledge that as long as they stand, the darkness stays where it belongs. I hope this journey has given you a deeper appreciation for one of the most compelling and underappreciated corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The Shadowkeepers deserve to be known, even if, within the fiction, their entire existence is predicated on not being known. That paradox is part of what makes them so fascinating, and it is part of what makes exploring their story so rewarding. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the most secretive and fascinating corner of the Adeptus Custodes, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you are not already subscribed, I'd consider joining the community. We cover all things Warhammer 40,000 here at Q on 40K, diving deep into the lore, exploring the darkest and most compelling stories that this incredible setting has to offer, and doing it all in a way that is meant to be a relaxing, immersive experience you can settle into at the end of a long day. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. Did the Shadowkeepers fascinate you as much as they fascinate me? What do you think is locked in the deepest levels of the dark cells? And which Warhammer 40,000 topic would you like me to explore next? I read every comment, and your suggestions help shape the direction of this channel. Subscribe, hit the notification bell so you do not miss the next one, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, stay safe out there. And remember, somewhere beneath the Imperial Palace, the Shadowkeepers are standing watch. The darkness is contained, for now.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.